Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D in WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Wilbur Woke Up in My Hero Academia. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The scent of gunpowder still hung in the air, his ears still ringing from the explosion caused by his very hands. Standing near the edge of where the button had once been, Wilbur came face to face with the destruction he had caused. Never before had a crater caused him such a great sense of relief. A laughter so maniacal it almost sounded foreign to even himself came from his throat, his knees giving out from under him. Behind him, he could hear Philza, his own father, express his shock and disgust at the sight in front of him. Turning his head to the man, he couldn't stop the grin from spreading across his lips as his dull brown eyes met Phil's concerned blue ones. He cackled as he rose to his feet, spreading his arms out as he turned to face the crater that was once Elmanberg. My Elmanberg, Phil, my unfinished symphony, forever unfinished. Wilbur cried out in joy. If I can't of this, no one can. Was this his only reason for blowing up Elmanberg? The selfish idea that it belonged to him, and only him? No, of course not. But he couldn't deny the satisfaction he got from knowing that he was the one who got to destroy it. Not Schlatt with his smooth talking. Not Tommy with his immature ways. Not even Dream with his admin powers. No, Wilbur Soot, the president-turned-anarchist, was the one to finally give Elmanberg the ending it deserved. A nation whose foundation was built on chaos and turmoil deserved to end in the same manner. There was still one loose end he had to deal with. Opening up his inventory, he pulled out one of the swords Technoblade had given him earlier in the vault. With a grin, he held the hilt out towards Phil. Kill me, Phil. I want you to kill me, Phil. Stab me with the sword. Murder me now. Kill me, Kilza. Kilza. His words delved into manic rambles, pleas for his father to take his life. From the pained expression on Phil's features, Wilbur could tell the man didn't want to do it. As he shoved the sword into the man's hands, their eyes met once again. I can't, you're my son, Phil cried out, unshed tears in his eyes. His wings were spread out behind them, the black feathers visibly damaged by the explosion. Look, Phil. Look at this place. Look at all the work that went into this place and now it's all gone. They all want you to do it. So do it. Kill me, Wilbur pleaded, desperation making his voice crack. He just wanted to go down with his creation. It was never meant to be. Had he never convinced Tommy to sell drugs with him, had he never gone against Dream's roles on the server, maybe things would have been different. But it was too late now. He had made his bed, and now it was time for him to lay in it. He could practically see the cogs in Phil's head turning as he looked between the wasteland below them and himself, his pained expression slowly morphing into a forcefully blank one. It was an expression Wilbur knew the man had practiced, one he used on the battlefield to never show his opponents what he was truly feeling. A chuckle fell from the deranged man's lips as he realized the last expression he would ever see on his father's features was the same one thousands had seen before him. And here he thought he was special. A sharp pain shot through his chest, forcing a painful wheeze out of Wilbur's lungs. He lost his footing, stumbling into his father's arms. His eyes flickered down to his chest, widening a bit at the amount of red staining his once brown jacket. The diamond sword he had forced into Phil's hands mere minutes ago still had a slight shimmer over it as it stuck out of his chest, though the blood dulled it quite a bit. A calm smile settled on his features as he locked eyes with his father one last time. "Thank you," was all he could manage to whisper before the world around him turned dark. All he could hear were vague screams and horror as he slowly drifted off, though he swore he could feel a brief wave of warmth come over his forehead. Wilbur didn't know what he expected to happen after he died. He didn't necessarily believe in things like heaven or hell, though it was a bit hard to believe in hell when the Nether quite literally exists. Hell just sounded like the Nether but with more people out to get you. He had already had enough experience with people trying to kill him to enjoy the idea of hell. What he didn't quite expect to happen after dying was to wake up again. With a gasp, he blinked awake. His eyes squirted up at the bright sky above him, confusion settling in his mind. Where was he? This wasn't the button room. Even after the explosion, there were still remnants of the roof left over, and as Wilbur slowly allowed his eyes to adjust to the light, he couldn't see a single piece of stone above him. He forced himself up into a sitting position, a rough cough raking through his chest. The more he looked around, the more lost he felt. He seemed to be on a roof of some kind, surrounded by a bunch of buildings that all were around the same height as the building he was on. The city went on for as far as he could see, which made him assume he had to be in a city of some sort. Had he accidentally server hopped? It wasn't unheard of to end up on the wrong server when first joining, but he had never heard of anybody jumping servers when they died. Then again, he hadn't ever actually encountered anyone who had permanently died on a server before. Sure, he had met people who died in hardcore single-player worlds, but those had different rules. Those just sent the user back to the main hub, letting the player choose whether they wanted to be forever stuck as a ghost in their old world, or they could try again in a new world or a new server. Servers were different. Every single server had their own rules. Most had infinite respawns, meaning no death was permanent. The server Wilbur had just died on was different. The Dream SMP had a 3 lives rule. After 3 deaths, it was a permadeath. Due to the server's rather short lifespan so far, Wilbur was the first to actually use up his 3 lives. His first, when Aerith had betrayed them back in the final control room. Their name still left a sour taste in his mouth, even if he had come to see why Aerith had done it. He supposed he would be a hypocrite if he was still upset with them about the betrayal when he had quite literally done the exact same thing mere hours, minutes. Wilbur wasn't sure how long it had been since his final death ago. His second death had been on Schlatt's orders after the election. He grinded his teeth together as he remembered the goat hybrid's mad cackling, his shoulder aching with phantom pain from where the arrow had pierced it. And then his final death, his piece de resistance, getting stabbed through the chest by his own father after blowing up his own nation. He idly brushed his hand over where the sword had once been. No mark left behind from the wound save for a singular blue slash that spread from just above his heart to about the center of his ribcage. His clothes weren't actually torn up, his coat and shirt still in the exact same shape as they had been before he stepped into the button room. Which wasn't to say they were in a good shape. Spending weeks inside a ravine living off of minimal rations meant his priority was never to fix up the holes in his coat. But it was fine for the time being. He had bigger fish to fry than his clothes being a bit banged up. As he rose to his feet, he briefly opened up his inventory. His theory of having server hopped was instantly disproven when he saw that he still had all his old stuff on him. A few potions, some pretty banged up armor and weapons, some food, about 2 stacks of TNT, and a singular flint and steel. His backup plan, in case the button hadn't worked. After his first failed attempt, he had gotten into the habit of always carrying a spare flint and steel along. Sorting through his items, he tried to come up with an explanation for how he had gotten here. It was pretty obvious he wasn't on the Dream SMP anymore. The buildings were too nice to be on the SMP. The nicest build on the server was Aerith's castle, which was pretty ironic considering that very person had been the one to help Dream blow up Elmanberg up the first time. Peering over the edge of the building, he realized he might be farther from home than he had initially thought. The streets were filled with moving things he didn't recognize. The closest thing he could compare them to were minecarts, but even that was a stretch. These things were bulkier, and faster too from what Wilbur could tell. Was he in a modded server? He had heard of those before, but they were rare these days, especially public ones. A frown settled on his features as he scanned the streets for any other clues as to where he could be. Another thing he noticed was that there were a lot of hybrids around. He was no stranger to hybrids. Hell, his own son was one after all. The memory of his fox son made his hand brush over the blue slash once again, a painful jab of guilt making his heart feel heavy. Had he made the right choice, leaving his son behind? Some traitorous part of his brain whispered to him that no, he had left his son, his flesh and blood, behind to fend for himself. The more dominant, paranoid part of him screamed that yes, Fundy had decided to turn his back to Elmanberg the second he burnt down their flag and tore down the walls. His son had chosen to betray him. That it had all been some plot to spy on Schlatt in the long run, Wilbur didn't believe. It had been too genuine to be true. He had seen the crazed grin on Fundy's features as he stood on top of the flagpole with a flint and steel, had heard his cackling ring out through the air as he watched the fabric of their flag turn to ash. Thinking back at it, Wilbur couldn't stop the humorless chuckle from escaping his lips as he realized how similar his own laughter had been when he pleaded for Phil to kill him. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, he supposed. But the large amount of hybrids freely walking around was interesting. Hybrids weren't rare. On the contrary, they were quite common, yet it was rare to see a server with this many hybrids gathered together. The closest thing Wilbur had ever seen to it was Hypixel, though that server was odd in its own ways. As he observed the crowd, he realized what was so odd about these hybrids. Most weren't actually hybrids. No, most seemed human with some added attributes, like a man who had knives for fingers. Wilbur had never seen anything like it. Sure, some hybrids looked more human than whatever they were crossed with, but never like this. An idea popped up in his head, his hands instantly digging through his inventory for his communicator. The little screen was pretty busted up, though that was nothing new. It had gotten badly damaged after the first time Elmanberg blew up, and hadn't been the same ever since. Tubbo had tried to fix it on multiple occasions, but nothing seemed to be able to remove the charcoal-colored burns from the screen's edges. His fingers hovered above the chat function for a moment before he decided what to type. Divided by MSG Tommy in it, where are you? Player not found. What? Wilbur's eyes widened in surprise, brows knitting together as he retyped the command. Had he made a typo? Again, no player by the name of Tommy in it was found. The panic of waking up in an unfamiliar place finally started to hit Wilbur as he frantically tried to message his former country members. He tried reaching out to Tubbo, Philza, Technoblade. Hell, in his desperation he even shot Dream a message, but all his attempts were met with the same gray message. Player not found. Damn it, where are they? His voice cracked as he glared down at the screen hovering a few centimeters away from his hands. If he still had his items on him, it meant he still had to be in the Dream SMP, right? Right. And if he was, that meant the others had to be around here somewhere. With trembling fingers, he typed in the one command he knew that could maybe help him figure out what the hell was going on. Divided by list online players. Welcome to My Hero Academia. Current online players, unknown amount. He felt his heart sink as he read the server name. What the fuck is a My Hero? What kind of server is that? How did I get here? He muttered to himself, feeling even more confused than before. Tapping around on his communicator, he realized he couldn't leave the server, nor could he access the global chat. He cursed to himself, turning off his communicator and slipping it back in his pocket. So, he was on a foreign server but had somehow kept his inventory from the Dream SMP, where he had just died for a third time, which meant he was now supposed to be permanently dead. He could already feel a headache coming on. None of this made sense. As he felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders, his eyes fell on a staircase he hadn't noticed before. He assumed it must be a fire escape of some kind. Though why it went all the way up to the roof he didn't know. What he did know was that it was incredibly convenient for him. He slowly started to make his way down the metal stairs, his footsteps sounding a little off, though he didn't pay much attention to that, slipping out of the alley the staircase had led him to. He had no idea where to go. He had nothing, no home to return to. And from the looks of it, this wasn't the kind of server where he could freely build a new one either. Not like he had the materials for it, anyways. He had half a stack of logs and a lot of TNT. Not ideal building blocks. He just started to walk, deciding that anywhere would be better than wherever he had just woken up. Nobody paid him much mind, which made sense considering everybody looked a bit odd here. He supposed he wasn't the oddest looking fellow walking around the city. The crowd thinned out the further he went, and soon he ended up in a residential looking area. To his left was a beach, the gentle sound of waves crashing against the sand making his heart ache for Sally. He shook his head, tearing his gaze away from the glistening water to get a better look at his surroundings. The buildings were all built in a similar style, almost to a depressing extent in Wilbur's opinion. They all had similar colors, and from what he could tell even used similar materials for decorations and such. Maybe he was so used to the mismatched nature of the SMP that seeing so much uniformity made his skin crawl. Or maybe he just craved a bit more originality from buildings. This server was too tame for his taste. After a few more minutes of walking, he slowed down his pace as his eyes landed on a section of the beach that looked wildly different from the rest. Trash was heaped up in large piles, covering the entire area to such an extent that he couldn't even see the sand beneath it anymore. In the middle of the landfill of filth and other crap Wilbur didn't recognize stood a green-haired boy who seemed to be gathering up the trash. Cocking his head to the side, Wilbur walked a little closer to the scene, his curiosity outweighing his paranoia. His time spying on Schlatt from afar had done wonders for his stealth skills, the boy showing no signs of being aware of his new visitor. He watched the short teen push against a large metal construction that was about twice the size of himself. Wilbur decided now was the time to step in. "You need some help with that, mate," he drew out, voice still slightly hoarse from inhaling such large amounts of gunpowder during the explosion. The teen practically jumped up in surprise, whipping around to face Wilbur with such speed that he was sure the teen's neck must hurt from it. "I'm sorry, didn't mean to scare you," he chuckled, offering the boy a tired smile. The brunette relaxed a bit, waving off the brunette's worries. "Oh, no, I should have been paying more attention. You don't have to help. It's a part of my training, you see." The boy spoke fast, which would have been hard to follow had Wilbur not grown up with Tommy and Tubbo. "Training?" Wilbur questioned. He had seen a lot of different kinds of training in his years, but never had he ever seen somebody use cleaning as a form of bettering their abilities. The teen perked up at the question, excitedly nodding. "Yeah, I'm trying to get into UA, and this is a good way to build up strength for my quirk," he said, as if that explained everything. Wilbur only felt more lost as he stared down at the now beaming teen. "What's a quirk?" he innocently asked, briefly casting a look around the area. He noticed the kid freezing up in front of him. His dull gaze met the teen's questioning one of his brows quirking up. "You don't know what a quirk is?" the teen asked, sounding almost heartbroken. He reminded him of Tubbo, his voice wavering in the same way Tubbo's had when Schlatt had announced the exile of Tommy and Wilbur. Shaking off the thought with a shake of his head, Wilbur shrugged. "Let's just say I'm not from around here." He tried to play it off, but the look he received from the boy in front of him told him he had made a mistake. I thought everybody knew what a quirk was by now. This is Oh, you're not from Japan, are you? I think they call it powers in Europe. I'm not sure though," the teen rambled, catching Wilbur off guard. He was in Japan. "Oh, yeah, powers. Sorry, I just moved." Wilbur forced a sheepish smile on his lips, decided to play up the lost foreign kid dick for the time being. What kind of quirk do you have? He innocently asked, noting how the boy's shoulders fell at the question. I have strength quirk, but I'm a late bloomer. It's not really useful yet, which is why I'm training. Wilbur knew the kid was lying, the sudden speeding up in his manner of talking being a dead giveaway. Strength, huh? What's your name, mate? He asked, deciding not to push the quirk topic. My name is Izuku Midoriya. Oh, right, you're not from around here, right? You guys use given names, but we use last names. It's rude to use a first name. The teen, Midoriya, explained, which Wilbur was very grateful for. Offending people on his first day on a new server was asking to be killed again. And 3 times was enough for him. Thank you very much. It's nice to meet you, Midoriya. I'm Wilbur Soot, but you can call me Wilbur. Getting called just Soot would be a bit weird, if you catch my drift. He chuckled, lazily extending a hand out to the teen, who gently shook his. For a kid with a strength quirk, he sure had a weak grip. So, how about I help you out for now, eh? It's starting to get dark anyways. You shouldn't stay out here for too long. I'll help you move this metal hunk of crap, and then we can both go our separate ways, all right? Wilbur offered, the teen considering it for a moment before nodding. With a bit of effort, they managed to push the object to the edge of the beach, where the sand met the pavement. We can leave it here, for now, Midoriya mumbled between pants, struggling to catch his breath. Wilbur shot him a nod, not even the faintest bit tired. His eyes briefly flickered over to the 100 bar on his right wrist, humming a soft tune to himself. He was barely 2 bars down, so he was fine for another few hours. Is that your quirk? Midoriya asked, excitement visible in his eyes as he leaned over to get a better look at Wilbur's wrist. That's when Wilbur realized that he had to play along or he would be in a lot of shit. How could he explain to this kid that he was technically dead? Yep, it shows my energy levels, as well as my health. Wilbur held his wrist out to the teen, showing him the small heart and food bars. As he did so, he also noticed that the hand which he had brushed over his blue slash earlier now was stained with a similar color of blue, but only on the tips. That was odd. Maybe it had still been wet when he touched it. That's so cool. How does it work? Like, do you feel them lower? Or can you only see it? Does it matter what you eat? Like, does everything refill the bar in the same way? Midoriya started spouting a series of questions at Wilbur, so fast he could even rival Tommy's furious insult rambles whenever Wilbur told him no when they were kids. The memory of his younger brother made his heart ache. A flash of seeing Tommy at the bottom of the pit that was once Elmanber, staring up at him with eyes brimming with so many emotions Wilbur couldn't even bring himself to describe. He zoned out for a moment, only getting drawn back into reality by the teen in front of him starting to furiously apologize for his rambling. Seeing Midoriya act so widely different from Tommy was what made Wilbur come back to reality. Tommy would have never apologized. No, he would have just told him to stop ignoring me, bitch boy. I'm sorry I spaced out there for a second. I can't answer all those questions, cause I'm not entirely sure, if I'm honest. I'm somewhat of a late bloomer too, I suppose. Wilbur lied through his teeth, the sheepish smile back on his lips like it belonged there. That somehow made the teen look even more excited. You're a late bloomer too, but your quirk is so cool, he gushed, before realizing he had grabbed a hold of Wilbur's wrist. The older male just laughed as the boy blushed. Yeah, I've only recently figured out how it worked, still getting the hang of it. It wasn't a full lie, since he had no idea what a quirk was until like 5 minutes ago. He had no idea what was actually considered a quirk on this server. Anyways, it's getting dark, you should head home. Lots of dangers lurking in the dark. Wilbur hummed as he looked up at the sky, watching the sun slowly set. Midoriya nodded a bit, hesitating as he followed Wilbur's gaze. As the older teen got lost in his own mind, he didn't pay attention to whatever the other boy was doing besides him, until he felt a slip of paper brush against his hand. Here, my number. You seem cool, and I'd like to train with you sometime. Together this beach will be empty in no time. Midoriya's smile was contagious, a soft smile resting on Wilbur's lips as he slid the paper into one of the pockets of his jacket. That sounds nice, Midoriya. Now, run along before your parents start to worry about you. He laughed, waving the boy goodbye as he watched him leave. What a strange kid. Pulling the strip of paper from his pocket, he added the number to his communicator, sending the boy a brief message so he would have his number as well. He surely hoped his communicator was compatible with whatever system they used on this server. It seemed to work, as he got a message back only a few minutes later, sliding the tablet back into his inventory. He noticed an item he didn't have on him before he died. A compass, which on further inspection, was labeled follow. Oh, that's not fucking shady at all, Wilbur muttered to himself, trying to see which way the compass was trying to guide him. Against his better judgment, he decided to at least give it a try. It was pointing towards the west, so Wilbur started to walk. After about 10 minutes of walking, the compass started to spin around as he stood in front of an abandoned-looking building. It was a bit surprising to see a building abandoned in this part of town, as the entire area looked rather nice compared to the rundown house he was standing in front of. He slid the compass back into his inventory and cautiously pushed open the door. The place looked like somebody had left in a hurry, since most of the furniture was still in the house. A thick layer of dust covered almost everything though, so it was clear nobody had been here in a while. Wilbur got the funny feeling that this was the server's way of giving him a place to stay for the time being. And he certainly wouldn't look a gifted horse in the mouth. The house had one bedroom that was attached to the living room, a kitchen built into the living room, and a bathroom with a shower. Sure, it wasn't anything extremely luxurious, but to Wilbur it was magical to have a house with actual walls. He was so used to the slight breeze that always seemed to blow through Booktopia that having an actual house with 4 walls and a roof already was the peak of comfort to him. It took him a while to get rid of all the dust that covered the furniture, but once he was done, the place already started to look like more of a home than Booktopia ever had. That was one problem dealt with. He now had a place to stay. And with the food still in his inventory, he was good for at least another week or so. He had a week to figure out what the hell was going on. Once he was done with most of the cleaning, he let himself fall onto the couch, a loud sigh escaping his lips as he finally allowed his aching muscles to rest. As he stared up at the ceiling, the paranoia and panic he had been pushing down all day finally caught up to him. His chest felt tight, the weight of the situation taking its physical toll on him. The longer he allowed himself to wallow in those feelings, the more he started to reminisce of his life before the elections, before everything went to shit, when their biggest worries had been the lack of tourism in Elmanberg. How did everything get so complicated? One day, Wilbur was selling drugs with his brother. The next, he had to betray his brother to get rid of the evil that he himself had created. He wasn't sure if he was truly guilty for what he did, or if he was just guilty about hurting Tommy. Elmanberg got what it deserved, but whether his brother had deserved everything that happened in Booktopia, Wilbur wasn't sure. Somewhere along the way, Wilbur ended up dozing off on the couch, and by the time he woke back up, the sun had already come up. With a yawn, he got up from the couch, joints groaning in protest. He shook the slight achiness from his limbs, feeling stiff from his rather poor sleeping position. Opening up his inventory, he ate a few pieces of bread to refill his hunger before heading over to the sink in the kitchen area attached to the living room. He washed off his face and attempted to rid his fingers of the blue staining them, to no avail. "What even is this crap?" he muttered under his breath, scrubbing at his skin with more force than necessary. It had somehow spread to his other hand too, even though he hadn't touched the slash at all with that hand. Taking a closer look at it, the skin didn't even look stained. No, it just looked like his skin was naturally a bright color of blue at his fingertips, blending into the pale color of the rest of his hands in a way that almost looked natural. Well, as natural as blue skin can be. Wilbur let out a sigh as he turned off the faucet. It must have been some weird side effect from dying. Deaths usually left some form of scar behind, though they were usually in the area that actually caused the death. Maybe it had to do with the gunpowder that had covered Wilbur's fingers when he died. He didn't know, and he had a feeling he wouldn't be getting the answer to his question anytime soon either. Wilbur pulled his communicator from his inventory, the screen flickering on as soon as he did so. As he messed around with his settings a bit, he somehow managed to link up his tablet with the internet. What exactly the internet was, he wasn't sure, but as he tapped around a bit, he realized he could use whatever it was to figure out where he was. Opening up a new browser window, he started to do some research. His first big finding was that this server had a lot of rules. He thought Schlatt had instilled a lot of rules during his time as the president of Elmanberg. But compared to this server, Schlatt's laws seemed like child's play. Quirks were basically superpowers, from what Wilbur understood. Using them in public was illegal unless one had a hero license, which was another big thing on this server, heroes. As he surfed the web, he came across countless news articles and fan pages all centered around heroes. Basically, everybody in this server had a superpower of some kind, and some used these to become heroes. There were even schools for these heroes. The more Wilbur read about it, the more he started to feel like he was in a fever dream. Rubbing his temples a bit, he tried to fight off the migraine pounding against his skull. He kept reading, needing to know more about this server. Being in a foreign world without knowing the rules could get him in a lot of trouble, especially when it was pretty clear there were some really strong players here. He scrolled through a few news pages, trying to get familiar with which heroes were big names in the game. Knowing some basics would save him from making himself look suspicious. He didn't want a repeat of what had happened with Midoriya the night before. Once was bad enough. He had to blend in with this world if he wanted to avoid getting banned. Closing all the open tabs on his communicator, he flicked the screen off before putting it away. His next goal was to get a job of some kind. From the research he had done, he could gather that this server had a pretty solid economy going, and that the easiest way to blend in would be to get a job somewhere low profile. Somewhere where nobody would question his existence too much, like a store. People usually don't pay much attention to who's scanning their items. They just want to get out as fast as possible. A perfect place for him to hide in plain sight. The problem was that technically Wilbur didn't exist in this server. He had tried to message himself to see if that would work and got the same error message as he had gotten from all of his other attempts. His name wasn't on the player list, meaning he wouldn't be able to provide any kind of paperwork to his workplace, which wasn't ideal, but according to the internet there were still enough places that hired people without paperwork. It wasn't entirely legal, but Wilbur wasn't known for being a goody two-shoes. Blowing up your own country wasn't legal either, yet he still did it, and with a smile too. Stepping out of the house he had claimed as his own, his right hand once again brushed over where the slash had been. He had switched out his stained shirt for a yellow sweater he had found in one of the closets in the bedroom. It was a bit too big on him, but it beat wearing a shirt with stains in it. The weather on this server was a lot better than the weather on the Dream SMP. The air a lot warmer than it had been back in Pictopia. He didn't really need his coat, and had shoved it into his inventory. Leaving without it didn't feel right, as it was one of the last things tying him to the Dream SMP. He walked for a while, still getting used to the colorful crowd that covered the streets. People were a lot more polite here, too. Whenever somebody bumped into him, they actually apologized instead of just telling him to look where he was going. For a world where it was normal for people to turn into villains at the drop of a hat, Wilbur found it rather interesting that the general public seemed rather tame. No shouting over each other, no obscene words getting hollered at anybody who would listen, no random fighting on the streets. It was so tame and peaceful it almost made Wilbur want to gag. His eyes landed on a now hiring sign sitting in the windowsill of what looked like a cafe, about a block away from his new house. As he pushed open the door, the soft jingle of a bell alerted the tired-looking barista of his arrival. Customers were scattered around the small cafe, sitting at various tables and booths, chatting or typing away on their communicators. A cat brushed against Wilbur's leg, making one of his brows rise in confusion. Why was there a cat in this cafe? Taking another look around, he realized this was most definitely a cat cafe, as about 4 other cats were wandering between the booths. A grin played on his lips as he crouched down to pet the cat currently at his feet, chuckling as the cat meowed at him. Somehow, Wilbur managed to talk his way into the job. It only took one 10-minute talk with the manager for him to get hired, which he was rather proud of. Smooth talking had always been one of his strong points, and it was really saving his ass in this new server. Maybe the universe was finally going easy on him. The manager, or Nakamura as he had introduced himself, had put mail to work almost immediately, claiming they could use all the extra hands they could get. Wilbur didn't complain. It wasn't like he had anything better to do. The tired teen at the counter turned out to be a kid called Shinsou, who was pretty quiet for a teenager. Though Wilbur didn't exactly have the best reference for how loud a teen should be, Tommy and Tubbo were abnormally loud, and even Fundy had never been a quiet kid. But as the day went on, he did manage to drag the occasional response out of the purple-haired teen. "What are the cats' names?" Wilbur asked once the lunch rush had calmed a bit. Shinsou looked up from the drink he had been preparing, briefly looking over at the cats with an uninterested look. "The red one's name is Soba. The black one is called Matcha. The spotted one at table 3 is called Cookie. The one at table 7 is called Cream, and this little bastard who keeps sitting on the counter is Spa, short for spaghetti." The teen sounded bored as he listed off the names of the cats, shooting Spa a glare as he gently tapped the cat's back to get it to move. "Those are quite interesting names," Wilbur chuckled, going back to preparing some more drinks. Turns out, working in a cafe was hard work. Wilbur had to clean up so many spilled drinks, most caused by Soba, who seemed to have a personal grudge against coffee cups. According to Shinsou, it was indeed quite routine for the cat to randomly knock cups from tables whenever it felt like it wasn't getting enough attention. Never had Wilbur related to a cat more. As the cafe grew less crowded, he spent a while rinsing dishes while chatting with Shinsou. Turns out, the teen was applying for the same school Midoriya had mentioned yesterday. He hoped to get into the hero course, but from his bitter tone, Wilbur had a feeling the teen already knew he wasn't getting in. "Well, if you give it your all, I'm sure you can get in. How hard can it be, right?" Wilbur tried to lighten Shinsou's spirits, but it didn't seem to work. "What's your quirk anyways?" he asked, realizing he hadn't heard the teen mention it at all. Shinsou froze at the question, his lips drawing into a thin line. That seemed to be the wrong question to ask. "Never mind, that was rude to ask. Forget about it. I should go. Mop the floor." Yeah, Wilbur awkwardly tried to change the topic, ducking under the counter to go get a mop from the back. The air remained tense for the rest of his shift, which made Wilbur want to scream. How was he supposed to know quirks were a sensitive topic? That Midoriya kid had seemed so relaxed about them that he had kind of assumed it was a generally accepted conversation topic. On his way home, he couldn't stop the sigh from escaping his lips. Never had he thought he would ever miss the Dream SMP, yet here he was, wishing he could go back home. back to his brothers, to his father, to his nation. But Elmanberg was no more. President Wilbur Soot was no more. No, he was dead, just like the country he had started. Taking a deep breath, he tried to force himself to stay calm. He knew that at some point, he would have to face all of the negative things he was currently bottling up. But for now he was much more comfortable keeping his feelings an arm's length away. Emotions would only cloud his mind, and right now he couldn't risk slipping up. He was doing too well to let himself get banned over something as silly as feelings. Wilbur fell into a comfortable routine rather quickly, which wasn't that surprising considering he was pretty much trained to be as adaptable as possible. His father never stayed in one place long, dragging Wilbur along all across the universe to explore servers, single-player worlds, and everything in between. They never stayed in one place long, for better or worse. The constant moving around had made Wilbur numb to the process. Having to find his place in a new world he didn't know anything about was just another Tuesday night for him. That didn't mean he was happy about the way things had turned out. No, on the contrary, he spent most nights cursing out the universe from the roof of his new house. Turns out, getting up there was pretty easy, so Wilbur spent a lot of time just sitting on the roof tiles, watching the stars. While the air in the Dream SMP hadn't been polluted, the sky had been significantly more empty than on this new server. Working at the cafe turned out to be a bit dull. Not much happening most of the day. The kid he was working with, Shinsou, was there most days as well. When Wilbur asked why a child like Shinsou was working almost the same hours as an adult like Wilbur, he didn't get a clear answer, just a grumble to mind his own business. It didn't look like Shinsou was going to budge anytime soon, so Wilbur dropped the topic. The awkward air that had formed during his first shift had mellowed out by the time his second week of shifts came to an end. Sure, Shinsou was still closed off and refused to speak most of the time, but he did smile more, so Wilbur counted it as a win. During his third week, a familiar face walked up to the counter. Those freckles and wild green locks couldn't be anyone but Midoriya, the kid he had met at the beach on his first day. While they might have promised to stay in touch, Wilbur couldn't bring himself to actually reach out to the teen. It felt weird. Plus, working had taken its toll on Wilbur, and whenever he wasn't having a heart-to-heart with the universe on his roof, he spent most of his time sleeping. For some reason, this server made him feel a lot more tired. Maybe the sleep cycle was set up differently here. Wilbur wasn't sure. Wilbur was snapped out of his thoughts by hearing somebody call his name, brown eyes flickering down to meet Midoriya. "Oh, hey Midoriya. It's been a while, hasn't it? Time sure flies when you're settling in a new country." Wilbur laughed, hoping the teen would buy his excuse. The smile that formed on Midoriya's lips seemed to confirm his hopes. "Good afternoon, Wilbur." "Yeah, I can imagine." His eyes crinkled closed for a moment, making his words seem more genuine. A soft cough came from beside Midoriya, at which moment Wilbur realized Midoriya hadn't come to the cafe alone. The teen gasped, eyes widening for a moment. "Right, Mr. Toshinori, this is Wilbur. He helped me move one of those large fridges from the beach a few weeks ago. He's from Europe." "Wilbur, this is Mr. Toshinori Yagi. He's my mentor," Midoriya cheerily introduced. Taking a better look at Toshinori, Wilbur couldn't help but doubt Midoriya's claim of this man being his mentor. The man looked sick, like a strong wind would be enough to blow him over. His eyes were so sunken and they looked almost black, though he could see two bright blue pupils looking back at him. Everything about the man screamed frail, which made Wilbur wonder if he was really a suitable mentor for the energetic teen. Not that Wilbur was one to judge. Back in Pictopia, he probably hadn't been looking much better than Toshinori himself. With the future of his nation resting on his shoulders, which were still frail from carrying the independence of said nation to success, his body paid the price. Extending one of his blue-stained hands over the counter, he offered the man a handshake with a smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. Midoriya over here speaks highly of you. Now, what can I get you to?" The man's grip was tighter than Wilbur had anticipated. "Never underestimate anyone," a voice snarked from the back of his mind. He couldn't quite place who it belonged to, but it certainly wasn't his own. Scribbling down their order, he quickly got to work on their drinks. "Hey Midoriya, you applied for UA, right? How did that work out?" Wilbur asked, genuinely curious. Shinsou had gotten his acceptance letter a few days ago, though he didn't make it into the hero course. He was going to be in the general education course, which he seemed a bit bummed about. Though, to be honest, Shinsou always looked slightly bummed about everything, so Wilbur wasn't sure if his assessment was right. "I passed the entrance exam. I'll be starting in the hero course next week," Midoriya exclaimed, practically vibrating in his seat. Toshinori, who was seated across from the boy, fondly smiled as he tried to quieten Midoriya down. Lucky for them, it was a quiet afternoon in the cafe, the pair being one of the only few customers, so nobody seemed bothered by the teen's outburst. "Oh shit, nice job. Congrats man, I mean it." Wilbur grinned as he set their drinks down on the table. He had no clue what an entrance exam enthralled, but by the sounds of it, it was rather hard to pass it, so hearing his friend had passed it was something to be proud of. The teen shyly smiled under the praise, like he didn't expect to be congratulated. You must have done one hell of a job mentoring him, sir. Last time I saw him he wasn't half as beefy as he is now. Have you been training that much, Midoriya? Wilbur joked, sending the teen a playful grin. He is quite the student indeed, but I cannot take full credit for his accomplishments. He did most of the hard work himself. Toshinori sounded proud. The pride in the man's voice reminded him of Phil, who had sounded just as proud about Wilbur himself many moons ago. The memory of his father made a bittersweet taste linger on his tongue, one he couldn't quite get rid of. Swallowing thickly, he realized he had zoned out for a minute, having no clue what either of the other men had just said. Turns out he didn't have to figure out either, as the sound of a glass shattering rang through the cafe, followed by a loud sigh. Soot, clean up at table 6. Soba is at it again, Shinsou called out, for once sounding actually annoyed rather than just sounding bored. Now that he thought about it, Shinsou and Technoblade would probably get along swimmingly, both sounding like they would rather be anywhere else at any given time. Excuse me for a second, lads, I'll be right back. Wilbur excused himself, heading over to the table to inspect the damage. Soba had knocked a half-empty glass off of one of the tables waiting for cleanup, pulling a bucket from his inventory. He picked up the spilt liquid with ease. He hummed to himself, about to dump out the liquid, when he heard Midoriya rush over to his side. How did you do that? He asked, though it sounded more like a demand. Wilbur was confused, and it clearly showed on his face as Midoriya started to frantically motion to the bucket. You just swung your bucket and the liquid went into it. How is it part of your quirk? The teen gasped, stars practically in his eyes as he grabbed onto Wilbur's arm. The taller man felt incredibly lost as he looked down at the greenette. Did this server have different water mechanics than every other server? Did they not use water? Oh, yeah. Wilbur decided to just go along with it, figuring it would be less suspicious that way. I thought your quirk had to do with a health and hunger bar, Midoriya questioned, sounding more curious than accusing. I told you, man, I'm as lost as you are. Only realized I could do this about a week or so ago, Wilbur murmured, dumping the liquid into the sink. He returned to the glass, picking up the larger broken shards before grabbing a broom. It's like a video game. Your quirk, you have an HP bar, hunger bar, and can pick things up that others can't. I bet there's probably more to your quirk than you know right now, like maybe enhanced abilities. Though those Midoriya thought out loud, making Wilbur pause. That sounded like a good cover, actually. I like the sound of that, my quirk being video game-esque. Maybe that's what I should name my quirk. Wilbur cut through Midoriya's rambling, making the teen excitedly nod. That would be such a cool name. Did you see that all? And with that, the teen returned to his mentor, leaving Wilbur alone with his thoughts. The Dream SMP had never been a quiet server. Something was always going on at any given time of the day. Whether it be petty fights between members or bigger conflicts like full-on wars, there wasn't a dull moment during Wilbur's time on the server. From drug deals to getting exiled after a failed attempt at becoming the president, Wilbur never had much downtime back then. Putopia had been a bit more quiet, but not in a good way. The months spent in the ravine felt like the calm before the storm. Every second of every day wasted waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to happen. But even that period of time hadn't been truly quiet. There was still a lot going on, but everything had to be kept under wraps in fear of spies and betrayal. The server was different, Wilbur had realized. While it at a first glance looked just as loud and chaotic as the Dream SMP, everything was a lot more under control here. Sure, there were villain attacks almost every single day, but there were enough heroes around to take care of those. The longer Wilbur spent on this server, the more he realized how truly messy the Dream SMP had been. From the second Wilbur joined the server, there had been conflict. A server that only bred violence and conflict wasn't a good server, he was aware of that. Still, he at times missed the server where he had made his home. He didn't miss Elmanberg. No, he more so missed the people that Elmanberg was made up of. Fundy, his son who he had left behind without any proper last words. Tommy, his self-proclaimed younger brother who he had left to fight off one of the best PvPers in all of the worlds. Phil, his winged father who he had begged to kill him, to bring a perfect ending to his story. Absent-mindedly, he brushed his hand over where he had been stabbed a few months ago. The blue on his fingers still hadn't gone away, stopping just below his knuckles. It had even spread to his toes, and the area where the slash once had been. Why it was there, he still didn't know. Another chance his body had been going through was that his skin was turning gray. It started off slowly, with him growing paler and paler as the days passed. He only realized he looked borderline gray a few mornings ago. When he was about to give himself a haircut, his brown curls had begun to become too unruly to keep in shape, and making an appointment with an actual hairdresser was too much work. Figuring it was just another side effect from server hopping, he just focused on cutting his own hair for the time being. It helped him feel a bit more like himself again, seeing his hair back in the shape it had been back before everything had gone downhill for him. He still wore the yellow sweater, his old clothes bringing back too many memories. On occasion, he put on his old coat just to soak up the smells still clinging to the fabric. It smelled like home, like gunpowder, rain, and smoke. More often than not, he ended up falling asleep in it, hands tightly holding onto the hem of the clothing piece. He had a lot less bad dreams those nights. It was a bleak Wednesday night when things started to get a bit more interesting. Wilbur had been lounging on his roof like he tended to do most nights, watching the sunset as he ate his crappy dinner. Instant noodles along with a weird canned drink he had gotten from the supermarket. He hadn't been sure what it was, but the etiquette looked nice, so he decided to give it a shot. It wasn't like he could taste it anyways, his sense of taste never having properly worked in the first place. He found that it was incredibly carbonated, the liquid sharply pricking at his tongue with every sip. After his third sip, he decided he hated it. He was about to take his first bite of his now cooled-off noodles when something dashed across the roof of one of the houses just down the street. His eyebrows furrowed as he watched a blur jump from rooftop to rooftop, hesitantly moving to stand up. The blur was getting closer, and he'd rather not get knocked off of his own roof. Taking another sip from his shitty drink, he scrunched up his nose a bit. He really shouldn't have bought it. He watched as the blur, which turned out to be a person, slowed down as it approached the roof Wilbur was standing on top of, a grin on the stranger's features that screamed danger. "Hey kid, wouldn't you like to get some extra cash?" The stranger drew out, sounding almost a bit slurred as he stopped just a few meters away from Wilbur, careful not to stray onto the man's roof. Wilbur narrowed his eyes at the man, unsure what he was getting at. "Don't play coy, kid. I know you're a squatter. No shame in that. But I know a way you could get a quick buck. Some hotshots calling themselves the League of Villains are recruiting tons of people. They promise good money." The man continued, the grin on his lips making Wilbur feel sick to his stomach. "What kind of job are they offering?" he asked, unable to keep his curiosity at bay. He almost wished he had just hit the man off of the roof when his already insufferable grin turned cocky. "Some big attack on All Might. I think they're trying to make a statement, but I don't get paid to care about the message behind their work." The man shrugged. Now, Wilbur had a lot of opinions about the way this server was structured. The whole idea of people being either civilians, heroes, or villains was incredibly flawed to begin with. Things weren't that black and white. Also, monetizing saving lives felt incredibly wrong to him, though he didn't dare to express those thoughts. The few new friends he had made both wished to be heroes later on, and losing them due to his opinion on heroes wasn't something he thought was worth risking. That wasn't to say he thought all heroes were bad either. No, a lot of them did a pretty good job at keeping the server safe, which is why he felt so conflicted about the offer. Logically, he knew he should say no. He should contact the police, warn them of whatever this so-called league had planned. But, as much as Wilbur liked to call himself a logical man, his crave for action and chaos made him give his number to the stranger so they could send him the exact information of the job. He didn't necessarily want to hurt All Might, but the chance to be at the front lines when something this big happened was too big to just pass up on. If he ended up not liking what was happening, he could always turn back at the last second. Plus, this way maybe he could finally put his leftover TNT to use. Wilbur ran his fingers down the collar of his old coat, trying to fix a rather persistent wrinkle that kept popping up every time he thought he had finally tamed the stubborn fabric. It felt weird to be wearing the brown cloth again as he stepped out of his front door, looking almost exactly the same as he had the day he had died. The only difference was the length of his hair, though the beanie on his head hid most of his short brown curls. Even the undershirt was the same, his soft yellow sweater replaced with the faded gray one that still had a bright blue slash across from it. No matter how long he scrubbed the mark, it wouldn't come out, so he had given up. It seemed that whatever the blue touched, it stayed stained forever. Brown eyes flicked back down to the flickering screen of his communicator, checking over the coordinates one last time before he set off. Some mystery number had texted him a few hours prior, providing him with the location and a brief explanation of the plan. It was a shit, in Wilbur's professional opinion. He had seen his fair share of plans, both good ones and bad ones. This one fell under the second category, since there was barely any real structure to this plan to begin with. His instructions were to go through some portal, which made Wilbur realize this was the first time he had heard anybody mention nether portals, though he got the funny feeling that just like most things in this world, this portal also didn't work like the ones he was familiar with. Past that, he was just told to attack anything that looks like a hero. He read over the message a few times to make sure he wasn't reading it wrong. Those instructions were so vague. How was he supposed to know what a hero looks like? He's seen a grand total of 0 heroes in person. Sure, in his search for information about this server he had seen a few pictures of flashy-looking heroes, but surely not all of them wore bright neon colors. That didn't sound very practical. The coords he was sent turned out to be rather close, in a rough-looking part of the city. He wasn't the only one there either. About 50 or so people were gathered near the front of a building Wilbur couldn't quite read the name of. As he approached the crowd, his eyes landed on the two people at the front, who seemed to be the men in charge. The one on the right looked like he was a teenager, looking way too frail to be leading a villain attack. Next to him stood a taller person, who had some kind of weird purple void instead of skin. Wilbur wasn't sure how to describe it better than that. He looked like he had a portal for a face, with glowing yellow eyes resting in the center of it. He gave Wilbur the creeps. From the signs of it, the two in the front would go through the portal first, followed by the rest of the criminals they hired. Looking around, Wilbur had to admit he was impressed by the amount of people this so-called league had managed to gather. The problem was that attacking all at once just wasn't a good plan, especially since they didn't even know what they were up against. Brute forcing their way through this fight was a clear sign that this attack wasn't that well planned. The longer Wilbur looked, the more he realized how doomed this attack was. Some of the villains they had recruited were clearly more skilled at long-range attacks, their choice of weapons and their mutations being a dead giveaway. Why send in ranged fighters when you're going in for a close-ranged attack? Wilbur rolled his eyes to himself as he sighed. Maybe he had overestimated this whole operation a bit. He had thought it would be fun to see the chaos unfold, to watch the heroes go against the villains, but it turned out that he was just about to watch some petty criminals get folded by a probably stronger army of heroes. Flicking open his inventory, he considered just leaving. Nobody knew he was there anyways, plus with the amount of people there it was unlikely that they would notice him slipping away. His gaze lingered on the stack of TNT that seemed to be almost calling his name, fingers hovering above the stack for a moment. Even if they lost, it could still be fun to bring the place to the ground, just because he could. With his mind made up, he turned back to the front of the crowd, where a large portal had just been opened. His suspicions were proven to be correct, as the portal looked nothing like those he had grown up with. While it was still similar in texture, he couldn't spot a frame for it. The color of it was also weird. It was almost the same color as obsidian, instead of the rich purple color of normal nether portals. He didn't see any particles either, nor did he hear any of that oh-so-familiar portal ambience. It almost made him feel a bit bummed that it wasn't a portal like he was used to. Just another thing that proved he was far from home. A wave of roars filled the air as the crowd of villains started to storm the portal, making Wilbur sigh once again. Not only were they going in blind, they were also giving away their element of surprise. By all means, they deserved to get killed by heroes for their stupidity. Wilbur was near the back of the crowd, calmly sauntering through the portal. He wasn't in a hurry, and didn't really want to be at the front lines anyways. His sword had been gone from his inventory when he spawned in this new server, presumably still resting in Phil's inventory, meaning he had no real weapon on him save for Chekhov's gun, which wasn't optimal for close-range combat. One thing that this portal did have in common with the portals from back home was the wave of nausea that hit him once he stepped through it. Taking a second to get his bearings, he was a bit confused as to where exactly he had been teleported to. The ground was covered in dirt and sand, yet the walls and other structures around him suggested he was inside. From what he had seen of this server, this wasn't a normal design people used. On his left, he saw a large body of water with a boat in the center, and on his right a mountain. Why was there an indoor mountain here? Where was here even? His train of thoughts was derailed when he heard a familiar voice from across the room. Brows furrowing a bit, his eyes landed on a small crowd of teens standing at the top of a platform in the distance. That's when Wilbur realized he had made a big mistake coming here. The second his eyes locked onto familiar green curls, his stomach turned. This attack wasn't just against heroes. No, these villains were playing dirty. They were going after heroes in training. He should have known that they wouldn't play fair. They were villains for Christ's sake. He should have known better. Unsteadily making his way to the outer corner of the villain mob, he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't just let these grown-ass monsters kill these kids. This server was on hardcore mode. If they died, they wouldn't be able to come back. No child deserved to die that young. Eyes frantically flickering over the field, he came up with an idea. It wasn't his best plan ever, but it sure beat whatever the league had come up with. As the teenager-looking villain started to monologue, Wilbur reached for his trusty stack of TNT. Somewhere during the time Wilbur spent setting up his plan, the kids who had been on the platform were all scattered throughout the building. Some guy in a tracksuit with a weird-looking scarf dropped down in the middle of the villain mob and was taking out villains left and right. Had Wilbur not been busy, he would have applauded the man's skill. Seeing the man floor another crook, Wilbur couldn't help but wonder how a fight between the mystery man and Technoblade would end. Shaking his head, he focused back on the explosives in his hands. The chaos around him all blended together into white noise as he methodically moved around the building. His blue fingers stained gray with gunpowder by the time he was finished setting everything up. He couldn't stop the grin from forming on his lips. setting up a small line of redstone before turning back to the mob in the center of the building. Things had clearly gone south for the heroes, as the strong man from before was lying crumpled underneath the fist of some weird bird-looking thing. The teenager who was leading this whole operation was going on a whole tirade against the clearly already defeated hero, which made Wilbur wonder whether this kid was just a theater major in disguise. Wilbur felt the world around him slow down when 3 teenagers came into view. It seemed like the leader of the league spotted them at the exact same moment. A crazed laugh racking through the frail man's body as he dashed towards the trio, hand reaching out to touch the face of a green-haired girl. Wilbur's body acted before he could even properly assess the situation, an arrow whizzing just past the man's hand causing him to pause and look up, forcing his already manic smile into an even more theatrical one. He cackled at the dumbfoundedness clouding the teen's gaze. "You should have checked who you were hiring, hand boy," he drew out, craning his neck out a bit as he looked down at the now fuming male. He took a step forward, clearly preparing to dash at him like he had done at the girl before. "Aha, I wouldn't do that if I were you. One wrong move and this entire place gets blasted to the fucking moon. I've got this place rigged up with enough TNT to blow up a small country. Don't try anything smart now. You've been outplayed, motherfucker." Wilbur let out a cheery laugh, feeling as relaxed as ever. "Oh, cat got your tongue. You seemed pretty chatty talking down at that guy over there. Is it because I talk back? God, you really are pathetic, aren't you?" He swayed on his feet, rocking to the theme of his own madness, hands hovering just above the detonation button. "Move away from the kids, big man, or die with them. Final warning." Wilbur's cold voice cut through the air, smile wiped clean off of his face as he locked eyes with the leader. He wouldn't risk their lives. The teen drew out, his voice sounding so hoarse Wilbur wondered if the man had ever heard of water before. A chuckle left his lips, hand drawing closer to the button. "Oh, I wouldn't. Huh, that's funny, because I certainly think I would," he challenged, never breaking eye contact with the male standing a good 10 meters away from him. The teen twitched, fingers scratching at the skin of his neck. From the looks of it, it wasn't the first time he had done it either, his entire neck full of poorly healed scratches. "I don't like repeating myself," I said, "step away." Wilbur was getting annoyed at this point, itching to just get it over with and hit the button. Finally, his words seemed to have the intended effect. The villain stepping away from the teenagers. "Good, good. Now, step 2, get your bird thing to get off of the homeless man. It's bad sportsmanship to keep beating an opponent that can't fight anymore." Wilbur was trying to stall. For what? He wasn't sure yet. He just knew he didn't really want any kids to get caught in the crossfire of his explosion. Maybe if he bought them some time, they could get out of the blast zone. But by the looks of it, those kids weren't going anywhere anytime soon if the determined look on Midoriya's face was anything to go off of. "And what I said to hand boy over there goes for you kids too. Move and none of us will make it out of here. Don't play the hero," he warned, though his playful tone had died out. It was an empty threat, but the kids didn't know that. The horrified gasp that came from Midoriya's lips made a bitter taste rise to Wilbur's mouth, though he didn't allow himself to wallow in it for long. "We were here to kill All Might. Or you were. These kids have nothing to do with him. That you're having a prissy fit about him not being here is not their fault. You're mad at All Might for not doing his job, right? For failing those who need him. Well, if you want people to believe in your cause, maybe don't actively try to kill kids. Nobody likes a mass murderer. This is not how you start a revolution, you wanker." Wilbur knew he sounded too passionate about this. "You want to change the world, right? How can you change anything if nobody believes in your cause? Think for once in your goddamn life before you act." His voice cracked, making his jaw tighten for a moment. He shifted his gaze to the ground for just a moment, trying to get a grip on his feelings. "You can't brute force your way through changing the world. That's not how it works." His tone was softer this time, not as accusing as before. "You speak like you know what it takes to lead a revolution. You don't understand. Heroes like All Might, they're the scum of the earth. If I can kill him, the world will be so much better." The delusional undertone hidden within the teenager's voice made Wilbur flinch, scoffing when he realized he had probably sounded the exact same to Tommy back in Pictopia. Will it be better though? Or will another hero just come along to fill the hole All Might left behind? I'm not saying you're wrong. This whole hero system needs a lot of reworking indeed. But what I am saying is that your way of handling it isn't right. Wilbur felt a spark of sympathy for the boy, who was clearly so lost in his own delusions he was beyond reasoning. Wilbur's stalling turned out to be a good idea as a thunderous slam rumbled throughout the building. Turning towards the sound, Wilbur realized backup had arrived. A small army of what he could only assume were heroes were storming into the building, the slam having come from a door getting busted down. Another chuckle fell from his lips as he looked back at the villain, shoving the button back into his inventory. "Uh-oh, looks like the cops came to ruin the party. Sure is a shame. I would kill for a good explosion." Things got a bit messy from there on, a lot of voices all yelling all at once, making his already pounding headache feel even worse. The bird thing let go of the homeless man at one point, and the group of teenagers were about to move towards him when Wilbur cut in front of them. "Get out of here, kids. I'll get him out of here. Won't hurt him, Scout's honor." He shot them a lazy salute before making his way over to the beat-up-looking hero. "Shit, that thing really did a number on you, mate. Let's get you out of here. Up you go," he murmured to himself as he hoisted the man up into his arms. The man was limp in his arms, making Wilbur worry whether he was even still alive. A groan from the man made those worries fade away. My students." His voice was deep, almost like Eric's, though that might just be from how gruff it was from exhaustion. "They're safe. You can rest," Wilbur assured, grip tightening on the man as a painful-sounding cough racked through the man's limp body. This man must have been a teacher of some sort, presumably of Midoriya's hero class. It explained how the man had been able to go up against a swarm of villains and come out victorious. Though, it was a bit strange that a man who could only be described as homeless-looking was a hero. Maybe that meant there was hope for Wilbur after all. He smiled at the idea, shaking his head a bit. He brought the man up to the platform where the students had been gathered during the start of the attack. Spotting multiple heroes and other students stood scattered around the area, along with multiple emergency vehicles. A man with hair that looked like a straight-up banana approached him, looking like he was ready to tear Wilbur apart. Wilbur tried to raise his hands up a bit in a sign of innocence. "Don't shoot the messenger man. He needs healing. A lot of it." He nodded his head down at the unconscious man in his arms. "Eraserhead. Get him over here. Recovery girl is on her way." The banana-haired man was way too loud, though not in a normal way. No, his voice didn't seem naturally brash like Tommy's had been. It sounded like it was enhanced in some way. A quirk maybe. Now wasn't the time to ask, so Wilbur let it go. He carefully lowered the hero onto a nearby stretcher, watching him get whisked away by a healer almost immediately. He didn't see them pull out any health pots, but assumed they would at some point. Meanwhile, a lot was happening behind him. By the time he rejoined the group of students on the platform, All Might had defeated the bird-looking thing, and slowly but surely all the villains were getting rounded up by the army of heroes that had shown up. As he leaned against a nearby wall, he caught a few snippets of conversations the teens were having. Apparently, the portal head man had split the teens up into groups and had scattered them all throughout the building. Some looked more shaken up than others. One in particular just looked more mad than anything. His eyes landed on those familiar green curls, feet moving before he even realized it. "Midoriya, are you all right?" "Jesus, that was terrifying. Had I known you were here," Wilbur started, though he got cut off by Midoriya tackling him into a hug. "That was why were you? I don't understand. But, thank you. You saved Sue's life. I don't think I would have been able to reach her in time." The teen stammered, making Wilbur blink. He chuckled, ruffling Midoriya's hair. "It's fine, kid. And to answer your question, I was here purely because I was bored. Got invited to join some weird rebellion against heroes, and decided, well, it's not like I've got anything better to do with my Tuesday morning." He grinned. The kid didn't seem to believe him, even if it was actually the truth. "Were you really? Was the button fake?" Midoriya asked, swallowing thickly. Wilbur hummed as he took a step away from the teen, fingers brushing over the button in his inventory. "It was real. I'm a man of my word. Didn't plan on actually lighting it though. Plus, I highly oversold the amount of TNT I placed. Barely placed enough to cause a crater. Plus, with all the water around would have limited the blast anyways," he explained, Midoriya hesitantly nodding at his words. "Is what you said true? Do you hate heroes?" That made Wilbur pause once again. He shook his head as he carefully picked his next words. "I don't hate heroes. I just dislike the hero system. Monetizing saving lives is a dangerous game. I think some revisions are needed. But, at the very core, I don't think the heroes themselves are bad. So don't worry your little head about it, kid. I'm not a villain sympathizer or a hero hater. Just some guy with opinions." That seemed to be the right thing to say, as a thoughtful expression passed over Midoriya's features. "Anyways, enough questioning my moral system. You need to go see a healer. Plus, I think your classmates could use you right now." Wilbur gave the boy one last salute before heading towards the exit, humming a soft tune to himself as he shoved his hands into his pockets. He briefly considered going back to grab the unlit TNT, but decided against it. It wasn't like he had any use for it anyways. He was about to leave, when somebody grabbed onto his wrist. A hero who was dressed in clothes that made Wilbur wonder how she was allowed near children had stopped him, a grin on her lips. "Where do you think you're going, hot stuff?" she purred, making Wilbur's skin itch. "Well, I have a shift tonight and I'd really hate to be late, so I was just going to leave. You guys don't need my backup anyways." He sheepishly smiled, hoping she would just let him go. "Oh, I don't think so, big boy. Nezu has requested to meet you, and I really can't say no to him. You know how it is with men. Say no one time and they get all prissy," she laughed, though Wilbur didn't find it very humorous. No, he was panicking, big time. Who was this Nezu figure? Should he be worried about meeting him? He was about to make a run for it, when a weird scent hit his nose. A purple mist started to swirl in his field of vision, though whether it was real or not Wilbur wasn't sure. The world around him started to grow muffled as he felt his knees give out from under him. The last thing he felt was the coarse ground hitting his face, eyes fluttering closed as he felt someone pull him up. The world went black after that. No sound to be heard save for his own heartbeat for just a second before that too faded. The first thing Wilbur noted when he came back to was that whatever he was laying on was soft as hell. He couldn't remember the last time he had been this comfortable. The bed in his house was old, the mattress springs pricking in his back whenever he laid down on it. A soft sigh left his lips as he let himself relax against the plush fabric underneath him. Memories of the events that had transpired earlier slowly came back to him, the panic from before returning. He had no idea where he was or how he got here. All he remembered was speaking to some woman and promptly passing out afterwards. From there on everything was just black. "I know you're awake, Mr. Soot." A voice drew out, making Wilbur flinch. He slowly cranked his eyes open, forcing himself up into a sitting position as he turned to face whoever was in the room with him. He came face to face with some kind of bear hybrid, who looked a bit like a younger Fundy. His son had looked a lot more like a fox as a kid, and had only begun to look human around the time Sally left. The bear had a smile on his lips, a cup of tea nursed between his paws. Realizing he was staring at the bear's paws for a moment too long, he forced his gaze back to the bear's face. "Is something the matter?" the bear asked, the smile on his face suggesting he already knew what Wilbur was going to say. He awkwardly cleared his throat, unable to stop the faint smile from spreading across his lips. "Your paws, they remind me of my son's. I'm sorry, that was pretty rude of me to just stare." That seemed to be different from what the bear was expecting, his lips twitching as he stared into Wilbur's eyes. The curious glint that crossed over the bear's eyes made the hair on Wilbur's neck stand up straight. "Your son?" he inquired, a friendly smile replacing the coy one from before. "Yeah, Fundy. He's great, a good kid. Too smart for his own good." Wilbur's throat felt tight the more he reminisced about his son. A cup of tea similar to the one the bear was sipping from was slid towards him, which Wilbur gratefully took. Taking a few sips, he allowed himself to remember his past for a moment. He knew he hadn't always been a good father. Of course he had tried his best, but he just wasn't fit to be a dad. He was too young, too immature, too focused on other things. Fundy was probably better off without him around. The thought made the tea turn bitter on his tongue, which was ironic since he couldn't properly taste the tea in the first place. "You are a curious case, Mr. Soot." The bear broke through the silence after a few moments. "According to my findings, you do not exist. You have no paper trail, no birth certificate, no school records, no criminal record. Nothing. It is almost like you just appeared one day." He paused to take a sip from his tea, though Wilbur suspected it was just to see Wilbur squirm a bit longer. "During the attack we lost contact with the USJ. You can imagine my surprise when we finally got eyes on the situation again, only to see a man nobody knew of to be challenging an army of villains all on his own. What you did was highly dangerous, Mr. Soot, and not to mention incredibly illegal." Wilbur felt like he was being told off by Phil for sneaking out. Flashback of his 16-year-old self mopping around for hours afterwards swimming around his mind. Yet, if you had not interfered, things could have gotten a lot more ugly. From what we know, the mutant they called Nama was specifically built to kill All Might. Had any other hero, or gods forbid, a student gone up against it, death would be the ultimate outcome. "So, I wish to thank you for your help." Wilbur blinked, a bit surprised by the sudden change of pace. The bear widely grinned, looking like he knew exactly what he was putting Wilbur through. "My name is Nezu. I'm the principal of UA. You saved the lives of my students, and of one of my teachers, Eraserhead. Though just because I am grateful for your actions does not mean I do not have any questions for you." "You are an interesting case, Mr. Soot," Nezu announced, climbing on top of the table to be on eye level with Wilbur. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. And you're welcome, I guess. I don't feel like I did a whole lot in that situation though, to be honest with you. I was just stalling for time." Wilbur sheepishly smiled, rubbing the back of his neck. The praise for his actions didn't feel quite right when he had literally threatened to blow up the student. "No need for modesty, Mr. Soot. Now, if you would not mind answering some questions for me." Nezu got back in his seat, eyes shining as he sipped his tea. "Let's make a deal. I answer your questions, and you make sure my name doesn't get written in any report." Just handing over information without there being anything in it for him was dangerous. He was taught better than that. Years of hanging around people like Schlatt and Dream had left him with too many trust issues to just willingly hand over important information. "I can certainly do that." Nezu nodded, the pair shaking on the deal. So, Wilbur told Nezu the truth. Maybe it wasn't smart, but something about Nezu reminded him so much of his old home that he just couldn't stop the words from spilling out of his mouth. He told him about arriving on the Dream SMP, about building dumb buildings just to entertain himself and his adoptive brother, about Schlatt getting banned, about the drug van. He retold the tale of Elmanberg, how he had started a rebellion and managed to start up his own nation. He went over the election, over what had happened in Pictopia, told him about his spiraling, about how it felt that everybody had betrayed him. His son burnt down the flag of the nation Wilbur had built for him. One of his old friends exiled him, his own right-hand man not agreeing with his plans. His voice was growing shaky by the time he reached the final act of his story. A soft, melancholic smile played on his lips as he remembered how the room had looked, what words he had said before Phil had walked in, the feeling of the button under his fingers when he pushed it. He told Nezu about how he died, how he asked his own father to stab him, and how his father had complied. Next thing I know, I wake up on top of a building I've never seen before in a world that looks way different than my own. Like, don't get me wrong, I've seen a lot of different worlds. Tournament worlds, modded worlds, survival worlds. This server is just so different to anything else I've ever seen. Nothing here makes sense. Plus, the players here are also plain looking. You're one of the first real hybrids I've seen in the 2 months I've been here. It's refreshing to finally see something a bit familiar, if I'm honest with you. Wilbur ended his ramble there, wiping his eyes before any tears dared to fall. Nezu had been silently listening, intently drinking his tea as Wilbur recounted the events that had led him here. That is quite something. You have led an interesting life to say the least, Mr. Soot. I knew you would be interesting, but you have proven to be even more of an adventure than I had expected, Nezu cheerily said, making Wilbur chuckle. That was one way of putting it. I do not fully understand how you could have ended up here, but by the sounds of it, you are not supposed to be here. I wonder where you are supposed to be right now, but I doubt we will find an answer to that anytime soon. You are technically dead in your own world, and do not exist in ours. What an enigma you are. The bear went on, his features pulling into a pensive look. I have an offer for you, Mr. Soot. With how badly injured Eraserhead was during the attack, I think he could use a teaching assistant. I have seen how you handled the attack, and I see potential in you. So, I want to offer you the job of assisting Eraserhead while he recovers from his injuries. Accept the offer, and I will get your paperwork sorted out. I cannot imagine it is easy to live in our world when on paper you don't exist. Nezu always spoke like he already knew the punchline of the joke he was told, Wilbur noticed. He didn't necessarily dislike it, but it reminded him a bit too much of how some people he didn't want to think about. I'm not a hero though, Mr. Nezu. I don't have a license. Hell, I've never even been to a proper school before. Phil homeschooled me. Wilbur wasn't sure he was cut out for the job. He was an unstable ex-terrorist whose only experience with kids was a son he failed and 2 pseudo-adoptive brothers he had betrayed before dying. Not a great track record. I said I would get your paperwork sorted. You being unlicensed will not be a problem. And a little birdie told me you do just fine with children. Young Midoriya seems to think so, at least. Nezu gave him a smirk that reminded him of the Cheshire Cat, making Wilbur scoff. That kid is too nice for his own good. I threatened to blow him up and he forgave me after I apologized once. Need to smack some sense into him, Wilbur remarked, making the bear across from him laugh. You will get along with Eraserhead just fine, Mr. Soot. I cannot wait to see how this turns out. But that, Nezu finally finished off the cup of tea he had been drinking for a solid half an hour by now. Wilbur wasn't entirely sure why he decided to visit Aizawa in the hospital. It was a few days after the attack, and apparently the man hadn't woken up yet. Even though Wilbur barely knew him, he still felt a bit concerned about the man. Walking through the sterile walls of the hospital, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Something about the way healing worked on this server made his skin crawl. Why did it take so long? Sure, respawning could take a while and healing pots needed time to start working, but never multiple days. It certainly motivated Wilbur to never get too low on health. He paused in front of the door of the room he had been told belonged to Aizawa. Checking the little tag stuck to the wooden surface just to make sure he was at the right room, he took a deep breath. He didn't bother to knock on the door, a nurse having informed him on his way and that Aizawa was still asleep. Sliding the door closed behind him, his breath hitched at the state the other man was in. Not an inch of his skin was visible, bandages covering him from head to toe. He took a few cautious steps towards the man, sitting down on one of the folding chairs propped up beside the bed. The only sound that filled the room was the steady beeping of the heart monitor across from where Wilbur was seated. You look like shit, old man. That thing really messed you up, huh? You put up a good fight though. Apparently that thing was meant to kill All Might. Yet you managed to withstand multiple hits from it. That's impressive, man. Wilbur felt incredibly out of place, but he kept talking. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to voice his thoughts, even if Aizawa couldn't hear them. I didn't realize you were their teacher at first. Thought you were just some mad lad who overestimated himself. Man, did you prove me wrong. The way you fought, it was easy to see you were fighting to protect something. Kept skittishly looking back, as if you had to keep an eye on something there. Doubt anybody else noticed though. The lot of them weren't that trained, I can tell you that much. Pretty sure I saw a bloke trip over his own feet on the way through the portal. Wilbur chuckled, gaze growing unfocused for a moment as he tried to remember. But you did what you wanted to do. You kept your students safe. All of them are fine, by the way. Last one got discharged from the hospital 2 days ago. No lasting injuries, whatever that means. I'm still a bit new to all this medical lingo. Hope you don't mind." The man didn't respond, though Wilbur didn't need him to. His gaze shifted to the flowers sitting in a vase on Aizawa's nightstand. "I was going to bring you flowers, but it's a bit cliché, isn't it? I got you something else though." "Now, don't laugh," Wilbur murmured, digging through his pockets. He had gone on a walk a few days ago, down the same beach he had met Midoriya at. The entire area was clean, which was a bit surprising. Midoriya had really outdone himself with cleaning it. Anyways, during his walk, a peculiar rock had caught his eyes. The bright blue color almost reminded him of lapis, though the shape wasn't quite right. "Once, when I was having a really bad day, Tommy gave me a piece of lapis and told me to calm myself. And I know that it's a placebo and that the lapis probably wasn't anything special, but it helped me feel a lot better. Now, this server doesn't have lapis, so this is the closest thing. It's just a stupid little thing and you can make fun of me for it later, but I just thought you might get use out of it, considering." "Yeah." Wilbur awkwardly placed the stone beside the vase. Turning his gaze back to the sleeping man, a sigh escaped his lips. "You have to wake up, man. Your students are worried sick about you. Hell, even the other teachers looked worried as hell when I passed by them. They miss you. I know that you need time to heal, and that you deserve to rest after everything you did for them, but at least give them a sign you're alive. Otherwise you're a bastard and I'll revive you myself." A playful smile rested on his lips as he stood up, making his way towards the door. He paused for a moment, looking over his shoulder at Aizawa. "You're a good hero, Mr. Aizawa. It'll be an honor to work beside you." 10 to 10 to 10. Nezu requested for Wilbur to come down to UA a few days after his visit to the hospital, claiming he needed him to sign some papers. The UA building towered over him as he walked up to the entrance, the architecture making even a tall man like him feel tiny. It felt familiar in a way though, partially because of the angular style used. Had this been built on the Dream SMP, it wouldn't have been all too out of place. Wilbur realized that this was the first time a building actually looked somewhat familiar. That thought made his chest tighten in an unpleasant way for just a moment. Though he didn't allow himself to wallow in the feeling for too long. He had a meeting to attend. The halls of UA were like a maze to Wilbur, and he spent a solid 10 minutes just aimlessly wandering through the building trying to figure out where Nezu's office was. Turns out he took a wrong turn upon entering, and had just been walking in circles since then. Huffing to himself, he gently knocked on the door, entering once a cheery noise announced that it was open. "Good morning, Mr. Soot. You were right on time. Now, have a seat and grab a cup of tea. We have a lot to discuss." Nezu sounded chipper as ever. Wilbur was much less of a morning person than the bear, but did try his best to keep up his good mood. Plopping down on the couch, he poured himself a warm cup of tea before properly settling down in his seat. "I need you to sign these forms, after which you will officially be a resident of Japan and a teacher at UA." Nezu slid a small stack of papers across the table, holding a pen out towards Wilbur. Taking the pen, Wilbur briefly scanned over the pages presented to him. He doubted Nezu would pull anything sneaky, but still wanted the peace of mind to know he at least checked before signing. Everything seemed fine to him, so he signed his name at the bottom of the page. Wilbur liked to think his handwriting wasn't messy, but it wasn't quite neat either. It was loopy and a weird mix of cursive and free letters. Looking down at the pen in his hand, a glimpse of his past passed through his mind, a flash of signing the Declaration of Independence making his chest feel warm. It was a waste he had given the book to Tubbo before dying. He missed reading the messy pages describing their wishes for freedom. Once all the forms were checked over and signed, Nezu got up from his seat to put them away. "I have more good news for you. Eraserhead will be returning to teaching on Monday," he announced as he pulled open one of the file cabinet drawers. Wilbur let out a hum in surprise. "Already? I was told he'd be out of the teaching game for at least a month." He questioned, still unsure about how the health system worked on this server. "A normal human would indeed need much more time to heal, but I fear Eraserhead is a very stubborn man who refuses to allow himself to rest, which is where you come in. I want you to support him as best as you can. I am aware you do not know much about the academic side of things, but I think Eraserhead has that covered himself. It is more the social side of things where I think you can help him. 1A is an interesting class with a lot of big characters who can be a bit much at times. I think somebody like you, who has experience with dealing with so many colorful characters, could help Eraserhead keep them under control a bit better now that he is not running at full capacity." Nezu calmly explained as he returned to his seat. "I see. So I'm basically a glorified babysitter." Wilbur chuckled, nodding a bit to himself. "If you wish to put it that way, then yes." Nezu sounded somehow even more amused than usual, which Wilbur took as a good sign. "Well, it wouldn't be my first time babysitting rowdy teenagers. I managed to keep 2 chaotic gremlins with pyromanicinal tendencies alive. How hard can 20 more be?" He softly laughed, Nezu chuckling along with him. The more you speak about your past, the more curious about your world I grow, Mr. Soot. Nezu commented as he took a sip from his tea. Call me Wilbur, please, Mr. Nezu. Makes me feel old when people call me Soot, Wilbur requested, resulting in a hum coming from said bear. Only if you refer to me as Nezu too. I think there is no need for formalities between us over tea. Tea has no need for honor fix and titles. Nezu mused, Wilbur humming in agreement. I'll drink to that. 10 to 10 to 10. The first time Wilbur ran into a villain in the wild was that same day he had his meeting with Nezu. On his way home, he decided to take the long route home for once, which meant he had to go through a somewhat rough-looking part of town. He passed by a poorly lit alley when he heard it, a feminine-sounding scream. Turning to peer down the alley, he spotted two figures near the back end of the area. A taller male was towering over a covering woman, threatening her with what looked like a knife. She was holding out her purse. Oi, cut that shit out, mate. Give her that purse back. I know times are rough, but stealing from other struggling people isn't going to help you, mate, Wilbur called out, rushing down the alley. The thief was clearly caught off guard by the sudden interference, freezing in his spot. The woman saw her chance to get out, rushing past Wilbur and yelling a quick thank you over her shoulder before booking it. Wilbur took a moment to observe the man in front of him. Hell, calling him a man was a stretch. He barely looked over 18 with how skinny he was. Chewing on his cheek for a moment, Wilbur made a decision. Stop looking so freaked out, kid. I'm not reporting you to anybody. You can relax. Now come on. You look like you could use a meal. There's a good noodle place just down the street. My treat. Wilbur offered his hand to the trembling villain across from him, who just stared at him wide-eyed. Why aren't you calling a hero? I just tried to mug that woman. Couldn't even do that right. Wilbur had a feeling he wasn't meant to hear that last part, and decided not to comment on it, because you clearly didn't want to do it. Desperation leads men to do things they will later regret. Anything to stay alive. I'm not going to fault you for trying to survive. Now come on, it's cold as shit out here. He flashed the villain a smile, his chest growing warm when the man hesitantly smiled back. The kid turned out to be 19, a dropout who ran away from a bad household. He scarfed down 2 bowls of noodles before Wilbur could get a word out of him, though Wilbur didn't mind. If anything, he was glad the kid was at least eating. It also wasn't like he couldn't afford it. Even though Wilbur liked to look like a homeless man, he made enough from his barista job to provide for himself and have some cash left over. Due to his health system working differently than that of the rest of this server, he had to eat a lot less than others did, which was great for his wallet. They talked for a while, Wilbur enjoying the company of the kid, who he learned was called Haru. And by the looks of it, Haru thought the same thing. A small smile had been on the teen's lips ever since he entered the noodle shop. By the time they were leaving, the once hesitant quirk in his lips had grown into a full-blown grin. Next time you think you have to resort to that, come to me. Please, I don't want you to get locked up for some petty shit like this. Wilbur ruffled Haru's hair, giving the teen his address before they split off. He truly hoped Haru would listen to his words, though he knew that might just be hopeful thinking. 2 days later, he was roughly awoken by rapid knocking coming from his front door. Blearily checking his communicator for the time, he found that it was 3 o'clock. Who the hell was at his door on a Wednesday morning at 3? He rolled out of bed, shuffling towards the door. When he opened the door, the last thing he was expecting was a panicked-looking Haru to be standing on his doorstep barely supporting a bleeding woman. I didn't know who else to go to. I found her in the house I was staying in, and Haru fumbled over his words, clearly freaked the hell out. Shit, get her on the couch. Wilbur stepped aside to let the pair in, rushing to the kitchen to get the first aid kit. He had bought it on a whim after he had seen the state Aizawa had been in, just in case this server affected his health too. Returning to the pair of teenagers, he crouched down next to the couch to get a good look at what he was dealing with. Okay, it doesn't look too deep. You are very lucky I watched some first aid videos yesterday, Wilbur murmured as he got to work. Again, his paranoia about how healing worked on this server had led him down a frantic internet searching session. He had learned a lot about how people heal on this server, which was probably the only reason this woman was going to live. His stitching was messy, but it did the trick. He stuck a large band-aid over it. Not really sure if it would do anything, but he had seen it on the internet, and the internet would never lie to him. His blue fingers were covered in red, a brief memory of the last time he had seen so much blood making his stomach churn. She'll be fine, just needs to rest now. You did good, Haru, Wilbur spoke up as he slowly straightened up, heading towards the kitchen to rinse off his hands. He heard a loud sigh of relief come from Haru as the boy sank down against the wall, head resting against his knees. Nope, no sleeping on the floor. Take my bed, Wilbur called out as he dried his hands, chuckling at the stunned expression crossing Haru's features. He watched the boy silently head down the hall, leaving Wilbur alone with the passed-out girl. He threw a blanket he didn't even know he owned over her before settling down at the kitchen table, knowing himself well enough to know that he wouldn't be getting any more sleep tonight. Haru had returned by the time the girl woke up. the three of them eating breakfast together as if nothing about the situation was odd. Wilbur didn't ask any questions, knowing he wouldn't be getting any answers. He simply told the girl to be careful with her wound, and extended the same offer he had given Haru to her, that she could come to him any time she was in trouble. She looked too young to be on the streets, and it pained Wilbur's heart to let her leave. At least she was sticking with Haru for the time being. That eased Wilbur's worries just a bit. Somehow, word spread amongst the community about Wilbur's actions. He wasn't quite sure what had warranted it, but he couldn't complain. As the week went on, he often ended up eating dinner alongside at least one stranger. By now they even knew his preferred hangout spot, some coming up to his roof just to have a chat. Most were young, barely out of high school, though some older people did occasionally stop by. Wilbur talked with them, heard out their stories, and provided them with comfort where needed. In turn, he learned a lot about how the system of this server worked, about how badly it failed those it was meant to protect. It made him angry that such a large group was left to fend for themselves. He wished he could change it for them, to give them the world they deserved. He didn't share his thoughts with them, knowing better than to share wishful thinking. Giving people false hope was cruel. Changing the world was harder than it looked. Wilbur would know. So he listened. He let them scream at him until their voices were hoarse, cry until their tears ran dry, let them vent out all their frustrations to him. He was no therapist, nor was he trying to be. What he was trying to be was a friend, and man did these people need it. Everybody just labeled them as villains when the only crime most of them had committed was developing a quirk society didn't like. Whoever decided to make some quirks seem inherently bad deserved to get punted, in Wilbur's unbiased opinion. As the week grew to an end, Wilbur was once again on his roof, watching the stars move above him. He watched somebody run by below him, smiling to himself when he heard the figure holler a quick night, Mr. Soot. Up at him, he shot a salute down at the figure, chuckling when he received one back. Looking back up at the sky, his lips wobbled for a moment. If you could see me right now, would you be proud of me, Phil? He whispered. A lone crow flew through the sky, its cause getting carried along by the wind. A wet chuckle left Wilbur's throat as he wiped his eyes. He couldn't wait for Monday to arrive. While Wilbur would never admit it, he found himself to be quite nervous as he got ready that fateful Monday morning. Dressed in his trusty yellow sweater and worn coat, he gave himself a quick one-over in the mirror. Running a hand through his hair, he scrunched up his nose a bit at his findings. "You're fucking with me," he muttered to himself, stepping closer to the mirror. Shiny threads of gray hair were starting to streak his hair, though it wasn't too visible just yet. A loud groan left his throat as he shoved his usual beanie over his head. Of course he was going gray at age 24, because the universe liked to rub it in his face that he was dealing with a lot of stress. One of these days, Wilbur was going to figure out what kind of sadistic person ran this server, and it wasn't going to be pretty. UA was a lot less empty than it had been the last time when Wilbur had stopped by. Early students and teachers alike scattered through the halls. He didn't really know any of the other teachers, and saying hi to random teenagers sounded a bit sus. So, he quietly scurried through the halls, still struggling to get familiar with the layout of the building. He found the teacher's lounge within 10 minutes, which he was very proud of. Making sure his beanie was on right, he slowly slid open the door, stepping inside with as much confidence as he could muster up that early on in the day. He wasn't the first teacher to arrive, about a handful of them already being sat at the various desks scattered around the room. A familiar banana-haired man was leaning over one of the desks to speak with a woman he vaguely recognized, though he couldn't quite place where he had seen her. An uneasy silence hung in the air as Wilbur was stared down by multiple heroes who looked 1 second away from forcefully escorting him off of the premise. "Hi, I'm Wilbur Soot. I'm the new teacher's assistant. I was hired to help Mr. Eraserhead until he fully recovers." Wilbur loved being the center of attention, except in situations like these, where people were actively analyzing every single part of him to assess whether he was lying or not. He hated being analyzed. Eraserhead got an assistant. Oh, he's going to have a field day with that. Mr. Lone Wolf got an assistant. Huh, this is gold, the banana-haired man exclaimed, his laughter breaking the leftover tension still in the room. Wilbur didn't know what the man meant, but just laughed along to be polite. Wilbur awkwardly hovered near the door for a moment, unsure what he was supposed to do. He barely understood the purpose of a teacher's lounge in the first place. Why would the teachers need a place to lounge? This server made no sense. Everywhere he went, he found more differences between his home server and this one. Before he allowed his thoughts to spiral, he made his way over to the small counter where a half-full pot of coffee was practically calling his name. "Could you pour me a cup as well while you're at it?" A gruff voice called out, making Wilbur pause. He cast a quick look around the room, eyes landing on the familiar mummy that was Aizawa. The man was still covered in bandages, and his arms were both in slings. It really didn't look like he was ready to go back to teaching. "Sure thing, mate," he answered, grabbing 2 cups from the cupboards. If his hands were shaking ever so slightly, he pretended he didn't notice. He brought the cup over to Aizawa. briefly wondering how the hell the man was going to drink it in the first place. I think you probably heard me earlier, but I'm Wilbur. I'll be joining your classes today to help out wherever needed, he murmured as he put the cup down. The man let out a scoff, probably frowning underneath all those bandages. Wilbur couldn't tell. Just stay out of my way. I already told Nezu I'm fine to teach. I don't need some kid to breathe down my neck all day. I've got enough problem children as it is, he grumbled. Wilbur sighed. Man, today was going to be a long day at this rate. He followed Aizawa to the 1A classroom a few minutes before the bell rang, settling for staying silent as his new coworker didn't seem like the chatty type. Though, he could partially understand Aizawa's annoyance. Being forced to work together with someone you barely know when you work best alone must be quite annoying. Still, it wasn't like Wilbur had much of a choice in the matter. They both just had to make the best of it for the time being. As they approached the classroom, soft chattering could be heard coming from inside of the room. Most students must have come early, since by the amount of voices Wilbur could identify there were at least 15 different people all talking amongst themselves, with more possibly silently present. All of the chattering came to a grinding halt as Aizawa slid open the door, heading straight towards his desk at the front of the room. A few students hurried to sit down, the sound of their chairs scraping against the wooden floor making Wilbur want to cringe. Settle down, class, Aizawa called out, even though most students were already quiet. It's good to see that you are all unharmed after the USJ attack. I hope none of you took my week of absence for granted, and that you kept up with your training, because Principal Nezu has decided that the annual sports festival is going through his plan. Canceling the event would be giving in to the villains, in Nezu's opinion, he explained as Wilbur took a seat. A spare desk had been placed in the back of the classroom for him. Wilbur was grateful he didn't have to sit near Aizawa's own desk, since the man would probably just glare at him for most of the day. As you might have noticed, we have a new person joining the class. Wilbur sit over there will be helping me out until Nezu declares my healing process finished. Aizawa introduced him. Wilbur doing a joking salute with a wide grin. Just pretend like I'm not here. I'm just here to help out whenever needed. He met Midoriya's eyes for a moment, wiggling his eyebrows for just a moment. The confused smile he got back made him chuckle. As Aizawa started to teach, Wilbur pulled a notebook from his inventory. There wasn't much he could do while the other man taught, so he decided to scribble down his thoughts on the students just to keep himself busy. His gaze slid across the room, quill hovering above the first page of his book. The list of student names he had been given by Nezu rested beside his book, listing both their names and quirks. He hummed to himself as he copied down their names and got to work. The following were his most noteworthy findings. Tenya Ida, Engine. I've been observing this class for barely a day and already this kid has yelled about other students breaking the rules on 4 separate occasions. Sticking to the rules is fine, but becoming obsessed with them worries me. What if on the battlefield you have to break a rule to save somebody? All is fair in war, after all. He needs to ease up a bit, otherwise he's going to freeze up in the field. Ochako Uraraka, zero gravity. She reminds me of Nikki in a way, appearing pretty non-threatening while definitely having the ability to kill a man. With her quirk not being very combat-oriented, some hand-to-hand combat training couldn't hurt. I bet she'd be great with a sword. Nikki was too. I miss her. Mashurawa Jiro, Tail. I've been told he's good at hand-to-hand combat, which is great. He seems like a more quiet character, but observant. I've caught him eyeing me multiple times during the day. He just needs to learn to be a bit sneakier. Then I think he'll do just fine. Maybe learn to use a weapon too, just in case. Denki Kaminari, Electrification. He reminds me of Tubbo, in a way. He's a chaotic kid, but is a good kid underneath it all. I think he's dyslexic too. Overheard him describe how he struggled to read a page to one of his friends, and it sounds similar to how Tubbo used to describe his issues with reading. Maybe get him books using dyslexic-friendly fonts. Keep a close eye on him. I have a feeling all he needs is a bit of extra support to excel in this class. Koji Koda, Anavoice. Getting him a communicator could make it a lot easier for him to communicate with the rest of his peers. Allowing him to use text-to-speech or written texts in class seems only logical, but I haven't seen him use any of those yet. Is it by choice? I'm not sure. I wish I had been closer to Callahan. Maybe then I would know more about how to approach this problem. Shoto Todoroki, half cold, half hot. Something about the way he carries himself reminds me of how Quackity and Tubbo behaved when they worked under Schlatt. All quiet and observant, waiting for the second shoe to drop. He flinches a lot, too. Keep a close eye on this one. I can't figure out just what makes him so on edge at all times, but it can't be good. Might be a leftover issue from whatever gave him that scar. Tubbo acted similarly around Techno for weeks after the festival. Maybe whoever gave him that scar is still actively in his life, causing him to be in a constant state of fight or flight. Maybe I am looking too deep into it. Katsuki Bakugo, Explosion. Where to even start with this one? At first I thought he was like Tommy, a bit rude and brash, but well-meaning and kind underneath it all. Boy was I wrong. He sees himself as better than everybody else in 1A and isn't afraid to tell them. There is nothing heroic about looking down on your peers. He also keeps going on about becoming the new number 1. While the goal of becoming a hero should be to save lives, I have my doubts about his chances of being a hero. The last thing people need right now are heroes who are only in it for the glory. Heroes with the mindset that Bakugo has is the whole reason those villains attacked the USJ. This kid needs a reality check. And fast. Izuku Midoriya, strength enhancement. Midoriya is a bright kid with a good heart. I've known him for a while, and I know he is giving it his all to be here. That being said, he needs to be kept away from Bakugo. Anytime Bakugo moves too quickly, the kid flinches like he's expecting a hit, a sign he has clearly been hit by the kid before. He doesn't flinch around anybody else. Same with the sound of Bakugo's smaller explosions when he is frustrated. Move Midoriya to a different seat. Minor reminder, pop off. In the wise words of Philza Minecraft, he deserves to be punted. I've seen him harass multiple female students during the day. He is clearly not fit to be a hero unless he changes up his act real soon. Next time I catch him in the act, I can't promise I can stay calm. Momoye Urazu, creation, finally, a quirk that is familiar. She is basically in creative mode, but needs to know the crafting recipes to create anything. Act calm and collected, but from how she behaves around other students with flashier quirks, I get the feeling she doubts her own quirk a bit, worth keeping an eye on. As the students started to leave the classroom after the final bell, Wilbur ripped the freshly written pages out of his notebook and strolled up to Aizawa's desk. He dropped the small stack of papers on the wooden surface, his face pulled into a controlled blank expression. I made notes on your students. You probably already know most of what I wrote, as you've known them for longer, but maybe a second opinion couldn't hurt, he explained, his lips curling up into a soft smile. Aizawa looked down at the papers, a soft noise of agreement coming from his throat. I'll read them, thank you, and I appreciate your help. I will not be here tomorrow as All Might is running a day-long hero training tomorrow. And Nezu thinks I'm not healed up enough for helping out with those yet. I would appreciate it if you could help him out. All Might is a good man, but he has a long way to go as a teacher. Aizawa sighed into his bandages. Wilbur chuckled softly to himself, nodding a few times. You are aware that I'm also a new teacher, right? He joked, drawing a gruff chuckle from the hero. Yes, but you seem to have at least some degree of common sense. All Might doesn't. Wilbur couldn't help but laugh at that. Don't worry, Mr. Aizawa. I'll make sure the number 1 hero doesn't do anything too crazy. Babysitting people with little to no common sense is basically second nature to me by now. On his way out of UA, he ran into Midoriya, who was chatting with some of his friends near the exit of the building. Yup, mates. Wilbur grinned, doing a mock salute as he approached them. Hi, Wilbur. Guys, this is the guy I was telling you about. The one who stopped Shigaraki from disintegrating too. Midoriya moved his hands a lot when he spoke, Wilbur noticed. He looked around the small group now all staring at him, an awkward chuckle leaving his lips. He was about to say something, when Asui herself beat him to it. Thank you, by the way. I don't think it would have ended well for me if you hadn't stepped in, even if you did threaten to blow us all up. That made the guy beside her let out a loud gasp, immediately launching into a rant about how that was not a very heroic thing to do. I'm just glad you kids made it out okay. And indeed, it wasn't a very heroic thing for me to do, but I never did say I was a hero, now did I? You can relax, Ida. I didn't break any hero codes of honor or anything. Wilbur laughed, shaking his head a bit. You're not a hero. But I thought all teachers at UA were heroes. Uraraka spoke up, making Wilbur hesitate for a moment. Let's keep it at, I'm an exception to that rule. I promise I'm more than qualified to be here though. Wilbur lied through his teeth. Getting to see a hero training exercise was a wild experience in Wilbur's opinion. First off, all the students were dressed in the brightest neons he had ever seen, which once again made him wonder how anyone could manage to be sneaky wearing practically fucking luminescent colors. He was just supposed to watch the kids train, All Might doing all of the actual teaching. The hero was taller than Wilbur had expected, now that he was standing side by him. Even the number 1 hero wore a costume Wilbur could only describe as slightly tacky. Now, let it be known that Wilbur was in no way qualified to make any judgment calls about other people's fashion sense. But a spandex bodysuit just seemed a bit cliché. He looked like he was straight out of a comic book, but in a bad way. Wilbur's arms were folded behind his back as he listened to All Might explain the basic premise of the training. It seemed pretty cut and dry in Wilbur's opinion. All Might paired all the students up in duos. Every duo would go up against another duo in a sparring round, after which the pairs would be shuffled again and they'd spar again. While Wilbur would have probably not made the pairings as random as All Might was making them, he did agree that it was a good practice to fight alongside somebody whose quirk might not necessarily work with yours. He watched a few matches, trying to keep himself from intervening too much. It was obvious a lot of these kids relied on their quirks too much. Barely any of them even knew how to throw a proper punch, or take one for that matter. As he watched Bakugo brute force his way through another match without even bothering to use a singular attack that did not use his quirk, Wilbur decided he had had enough. He closed his notebook and walked over to All Might. He had an idea, but probably needed the actual teacher's permission before going through with it. "Hey, Mr. All Might, I have an exercise I'd like to walk by you." Wilbur grinned, excited to share his ideas. Maybe he could knock some sense into these kids. "Nezu mentioned that for training you sometimes stage villain attacks, right? Well, I want to do just that, except nobody can use quirks. It'll push the kids to be more resourceful. I'll play the villain. My quirk is not that strong, so it'll barely give me an advantage." He had to stop himself from bouncing in his spot. A pensive expression crossed All Might's features as he considered it. "Well, that does sound like it would be good for the students to learn." "Fine. Would you like to explain it to the students?" he questioned, making Wilbur's grin widen. "Sure thing, Mr. All Might." That's how Wilbur found himself standing on the top floor of one of the buildings on the training grounds. The students were split up into groups of 4, with Wilbur having made the groups this time around. He had made them as balanced as possible. The groups were as follows: Bakugo, Aoyama, Shiro and Ida, Uraraka, Shoji, Ajaru and Yaoyorozu, Midoriya, Asui, Mina and Kirishima, Hagakure, Kaminari, Takoyami and Sado, and finally Jiru, Mina, Kuda and Mainta. The exercise was slightly altered, just to make it a bit more challenging for the kids, in All Might's opinion. While Wilbur was slightly peeved that All Might thought he would let himself get captured easily, he still went along with it. The students had 10 minutes to either subdue Wilbur or save the hostage he was keeping. The hostage in this situation was All Might, who was sitting tied to a chair, looking as cheery as ever. Wilbur, always one for dramatics, had placed a few pieces of TNT around, just to finish off the scene. As a loud horn rang through the training grounds, the exercise started. For some reason, there were speakers hung throughout the building. All Might said they were for monitoring purposes, so they could verbally intervene in case anything went wrong. Wilbur just found it mighty convenient, and asked for access to them. Once his communicator was hooked up to the speakers, Wilbur started the show. If he was to play a villain, he was going to do it right. "Hello there, heroes. I, Wilbur Soot, have taken your precious little number 1 hostage. Now, I know that might be a bit upsetting, and that you're probably already on your way to save him. Just know that I'll be waiting for you, and if I see even just one trace of any of you using your quirks, I will press this pretty little button here. And you don't want to know what happens when I hit the button. I can give you a hint though. It involves some redstone, a button and enough explosions to level this city. I'd hurry if I were you. I tend to push buttons when I'm bored," Wilbur practically sang into his communicator, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he pulled his trusty crossbow from his inventory. All Might looked a lot less cheery, his concerned gaze meeting Wilbur's theatrical crazed ones. "I told you, I make a great villain." He laughed as he left the room, off to hunt down the first group of students sent after him. The first group was not a group that necessarily worried Wilbur. Ida and Bakugo were good at fighting, but both relied on their quirk too much. Shiro was a bit clumsy, and Aoyama just wasn't a fighter. They could easily win though, if they just worked together. The 4 of them could overpower Wilbur, or they could split up and keep him busy with one part of the group while the others took care of the hostage. The thing was that Wilbur knew this group wouldn't be able to pull either of those tricks off, just because that would require teamwork, and from what he had seen from these 4 students, teamwork was not their specialty. As Wilbur made his way through the halls of the building, he made sure to knock over some of the abandoned furniture to create obstacles, both to make it harder for the students to reach the hostage within the time limit, and to give him places to take cover just in case. He briefly checked how many arrows he had left, and made sure only to use his non-lethal ones with stumped-down tips. He didn't want to harm any of the students, not lastingly anyways. True to Wilbur's predictions, the group wasn't working together all too well, their loud arguing being audible across multiple floors. From the snippets Wilbur caught, Bakugo had gone rogue, with Ida hot on his tail to stop him. Shiro and Aoyama were sticking together, looking down at the roll of tape still in his inventory. He decided to take out the latter duo first, since they were easier to deal with. Pulling up the layout of the building on his communicator, he managed to just barely dodge Ida and Bakugo, and instead ran straight into Shiro and Aoyama. They tried their best, but Wilbur was simply better. He rammed Aoyama against a wall, causing the boy to slink to the floor in defeat. Wilbur was pretty sure the kid was being dramatic, as he hadn't even hit him that hard, but didn't have the time to ponder it too long. Shiro put up a bit more of a fight, but failed to pay attention to his surroundings. He stumbled over something, after which it only took one swift kick for Wilbur to topple the boy. He left both boys taped to each other, softly tisking to himself as he dusted off his hands. Good effort, lads, but you'll need to train a lot more if you want to beat an actual villain without your quirks. He chuckled, grabbing Chekhov's gun from where he had haphazardly thrown it down during the fight. Finding Ada and Bakugo wasn't too hard. The two still stuck in a screaming match just a few halls away from where All Might was tied up. Wilbur hummed to himself as he watched the two yell at each other, briefly checking the time left for the exercise. 1 minute. Looking back at the teens, he realized he might as well just let them tire each other out. But where was the fun in that? Jesus, you two argue more than me and Tommy do. That's almost impressive. Wilbur drew out, laughing as he stepped towards them. I'm going to kill you, Bakugo practically screamed, glowering at the taller man. Wilbur stared him down, unimpressed by what he was seeing. You think you have what it takes to kill me? Don't make me laugh. He shook his head, sliding Chekhov's gun back into his inventory. He spread out his arms, giving Bakugo a challenging look. What are you waiting for? Kill me then. That got the boy moving. His attempted punches and kicks were messy, his body language giving away his next move at almost any given moment. Wilbur mostly stayed on the defensive, with the goal of stalling until the timer ran out. Ida had gone off to get the hostage, but with a minute on the timer he wouldn't have enough time to get All Might to the ground level. Bakugo kept yelling insults and death threats, his attacks growing more and more sloppy. Why aren't you fighting back? He screamed, heavily panting as he took a step back. Wilbur smirked, barely out of breath himself. He held up his communicator right as the timer hit 0. The alarm went off once more, signaling the end of the exercise. The villain wins. The rest of the exercises all blended together for Wilbur as he got more and more lost in his role. No group managed to save the hostage, only one group managing to pin Wilbur down. Uraraka, Shoji, Ajiru and Yaoyorozu were the only ones who defeated him, purely because of Ajiru's martial art training. He was faster on his feet than Wilbur, and fairly beat him. As his feet were swept out from under him, Wilbur felt a wave of genuine panic flood his system. His breaths grew shallow as he felt tape being wrapped around his wrists. The alarm went off, a mechanic voice announcing that the heroes had won. For a moment he was back in the final control room, listening to one of his most trusted men proclaim that it was never meant to be before hitting a button. He remembered feeling the blade cut through his neck, though the face of whoever had attacked him was fuzzy in his mind. His lungs felt too tight, like he was being held underwater. Voices vaguely registered in his head, though he couldn't make out what they were saying. He could move his hands again, and wasted no time to scramble up from the ground, summoning his bow from his inventory. He scanned his surroundings with unfocused eyes. Black stone walls slowly transformed into cold stone ones, the torchlight being replaced by the light coming off of the lamps screwed to the ceiling. Wilbur's panicked breaths slowly evened out as he slowly came back to reality. Gathered around him stood 4 children, all looking with varying degrees of worry. Lowering his bow, he took a moment to recollect himself. He wasn't in the final control room. He wasn't even in that server anymore. Mr. Soot, are you okay? Uraraka asked. The sympathy in her tone made Wilbur want to vomit, forcing a grin on his lips. He shoved down any leftover negative feelings. He couldn't appear weak in front of these kids. Yeah, just peaky. Sorry, got lost in thought there for a moment. Congrats on beating me though. Wilbur was grateful for his acting skills, since it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart at the minute. Wilbur excused himself after the final group was done, lying to All Might that he had overused his quirk and was too tired to continue the training session for the day. Whether All Might actually bought the excuse or knew something else was up, Wilbur didn't know, nor did he have the energy to care. He left the training grounds, shoving his still trembling hands in his pockets. That hadn't happened before, that he couldn't recognize his surroundings. Why had that happened? He was over what had happened back then. Freezing up like that would get him killed in the field. Huffing to himself, Wilbur made his way through the UA building, wanting nothing more than a hot cup of coffee and maybe a nap. Maybe if he slept enough, he could pretend that never happened. The teacher's lounge was completely empty, which wasn't that surprising since it was the middle of the day. Most teachers were probably doing their job or didn't have classes today in the first place. Wilbur let out a sigh of relief, heading towards the coffee machine. Once he had acquired himself a cup of the warm liquid, he sat on the worn-out couch sitting in the far corner of the room. He cradled the cup between his hands for a moment, staring at the swirling liquid in hopes to keep his mind from wandering. Tubbo had once described to him how he felt whenever he heard a firework after the festival, how he'd remember the concrete walls keeping him trapped and the soaring pain spreading down his throat as the rocket exploded. The more Wilbur thought about it, the more similarities he could draw between Tubbo's explanation and what he had just experienced. But Tubbo was executed in a traumatic way. Wilbur wasn't. Sure, the final control room incident hadn't been fun, but in no way as bad as what had happened to Tubbo. Right. Taking a sip from his coffee, Wilbur tried to reel in his thoughts. It was pretty clear he wasn't going to figure out what had just happened on his own. Should he tell Nezu? The bear probably already knew, to be honest. Nezu always seemed to know the latest news, so it wouldn't surprise him if he was already aware of what had happened. So it probably couldn't hurt to ask the bear what he thought had happened to Wilbur. But that could wait. Downing most of the contents of his cup in one go, he set it aside for the time being. He shrugged off his coat, dumping it down next to the cup before curling up on the couch. It was another hour or two before lunch, meaning he could get 2 hours of shut-eye before anybody would return to the lounge. Letting his eyes fall closed, he was out within minutes, exhausted from both the training exercise and his attack. He woke up with a blanket covering him, with the lounge still empty. Blearily looking around, he also noticed his cup had been cleaned, and his coat was hanging over one of the nearby chairs. A soft smile played on his lips as he laid his head back down. He'd have to thank whoever gave him the blanket later, it was soft as hell. By the time Wilbur was making his way out of the building, the sun was starting to set. Most had left already, classes having ended a little while ago. A yawn tore from Wilbur's lips as he stretched his arms out above his head, a satisfying pop coming from his joints. He paused, locking eyes with a furious-looking Bakugo who was rapidly making his way over. A sly smile formed on his lips as he briefly checked his inventory, just in case. "Who the hell are you?" Bakugo demanded, sharp red eyes meeting Wilbur's calm brown ones. "I'm Wilbur Soot. I'm pretty sure I've been introduced multiple times by now, mate. Did you not pay attention?" He laughed, though it was forced and he was audibly tired. "I know your name, asshole. But what are you? You're not a hero. Why the hell are you allowed to teach us? I thought this school had standards, but clearly not if they're letting some villain-looking bastard like you teach." Bakugo grinned as if he was proud of the playground insults he was throwing at Wilbur. "Watch your mouth, kid. While you might not like it, I am most definitely still your teacher. A teacher who managed to outsmart you, might I add." Wilbur crossed his arms across his chest, meeting Bakugo's glare with a smirk. "Oh, don't like to be reminded of your defeat. Some grace would really suit you, kid. Nobody likes a sore loser," he remarked, wondering what the kid had expected him to say. "I didn't lose. You didn't even fight me. Some extra like you could never beat me," Bakugo loudly argued, making Wilbur roll his eyes. In one swift motion, Wilbur had his crossbow pointed under Bakugo's chin, a smirk on his features as he quirked up one of his brows. "I could kill you right here and now, and you wouldn't be able to do shit about it, kid. Just because you've got a strong quirk doesn't mean you're automatically the best out there. Hell, I've seen overconfident idiots like you die on their first days on the field because they underestimated their opponents. So, reel back the attitude. Unless you want to die a gruesome and bloody death, which by all means, go on. Keep acting like this, and see how far that gets you." Wilbur just wanted to go home. He wasn't in the mood to entertain some teenager who thought he was hot shit. Shoving his bow back into his inventory, he walked off before he could hear Bakugo's response. The kid screamed at him to come back, to which Wilbur held up his middle finger. Teenagers, man. 10 to 10 to 10. Wilbur wasn't sure what to expect from the sports festival. It was pretty clear that it was a big deal, and that it would be watched by a lot of people. The details were a lot harder to follow, so Wilbur didn't bother. He was sure he'd understand once he watched it all unfold in real time. He had ditched his coat for the day, though he did have it in his inventory, just in case. Due to him wearing it more often, it was starting to smell less and less like home every single time he slid it on. The idea that one of the last things connecting him with his home server made his stomach feel queasy. He knew it was silly, but the coat had been a gift from Phil, right before he set off to join the Dream SMP. It was one of his old coats, though the back had been patched up so Wilbur could wear it without there being 2 giant holes in the back of it. He hadn't worn it much during the Elmanberg Revolution, though he did sew a patch of the flag onto the sleeve with help from Nikki. During Pictopia, he hadn't worn anything but the coat, fixing up any tear with what few supplies they had. Sure, it held more bad memories than good ones, but it was still important to Wilbur. A lot of heroes were present at the festival, Wilbur noted. He didn't recognize most of them, though that wasn't all too surprising considering he hadn't bothered to learn any of the big heroes' names. During one of the meetings in preparation for the festival, Nezu had explained that he had called in some favors to get as many heroes as possible on patrol around the arena to make sure the chances of another villain attack were minimal. Even all teachers were expected to patrol, with a few exceptions. Eraserhead and Present Mike were to present the festival, Cementos was on repair duty, and Midnight was to host the actual games. Wilbur wasn't put on patrolling duty either, since he technically didn't have a license. Nezu promised him he was working on that though, so that was fun. Instead, Wilbur found himself seated below the presenter's booth. He had a good view of the actual arena below him, which was nice. The booths to his left and right were empty, and all had different class names written on the doors leading into the booths. Wilbur assumed they were where the students who didn't make it through the rounds would be seated. It was nice that they at least got to watch after they lost, Wilbur supposed, though it must suck to get knocked out early on and to be forced to watch your classmates continue on without you. It was a good incentive to do better next time. As the classes walked out into the arena class by class, Wilbur couldn't help but clap a bit louder when he saw Shinsou walk in among the 1°C kids. Maybe he was a bit biased. Sue him. The purple-haired kid had what it took to be a hero, in Wilbur's opinion. He wasn't as obsessed with the fame and glory around being a hero, and genuinely wanted to help people. Why he wasn't put in 1A, Wilbur didn't know. Thinking about it, Wilbur realized he hadn't shown up for any of his shifts at the cafe for about 2 weeks now. He should probably apologize to his manager once he got the chance and formally quit. The top student was supposed to give a speech, which would have been fine had Bakugo Katsuki not been the top student at UA. As he loudly declared he would beat everybody else at the festival and continued to go on and on about how much better he was than the rest, Wilbur couldn't help but get the urge to punch the kid. Was this how people felt about Tommy at times? Wilbur never really got when people called Tommy annoying. Sure, the kid was a bit loud, but in a little brother kind of way, not in an actually bothersome kind of way. Bakugo, on the other hand, man, that kid made Wilbur's hands itch for his sword. The first event was a bit hard to follow, mostly because there are so many participants that the cameras documenting the event kept switching between people so fast that Wilbur couldn't keep up. In the end, Midoriya ended up winning, which Wilbur was very proud of. As he scanned over the list of students who had made it through the first challenge, Wilbur couldn't stop himself from smiling as he spotted Shinsou's name on the list. Like the previous event, the second event was hard to follow, but a bit more manageable than the last round. He was impressed by how well the various teams were working together, especially since some of them seemed to be rather random. The two teams he mostly watched were of course Midoriya's and Shinsou's teams. He was a biased teacher, sue him. Nobody told him he wasn't allowed to have favorites, and these two just happened to have a special place in his heart. Finally, they reached the final round of the event, which was a 1v1 tournament round. Wilbur couldn't help but feel excited, especially considering most of 1A had made it to this round along with Shinsou. Though, as the first matchup was announced, he felt his excitement dull a bit. Why? Well, because the first match was between Midoriya Izuku and Shinsou Hitoshi, the two kids he was rooting for. The universe really didn't like him having nice things. Wilbur was on the edge of his seat as the two students walked into the arena. He wasn't sure who would win. Midoriya had Shinsou beaten the quirk department, but Shinsou was more well-versed at hand-to-hand. On a slow day at the cafe, Wilbur had shown Shinsou some of the basics when it came to fighting. It was mostly because the older male had been worried Shinsou couldn't defend himself properly. He still didn't know what kind of quirk Shinsou had, though he did know from how Shinsou talked about it that most considered it a villainous quirk. While Wilbur knew Shinsou was a good kid, most didn't seem to see what he saw. So, Wilbur trained the kid a bit, just in case. As midnight announced the start of the match, Shinsou appeared to be talking to Midoriya, though there weren't any microphones around to catch what he was saying. The other teen responded, after which he froze in his spot. His expression was blank, unnaturally so. Wilbur didn't understand, until he spotted the smirk on Shinsou's lips. This was his quirk. It suddenly all clicked. Why Shinsou was so hesitant to talk. Why he hadn't made it through the entrance exam, why his quirk was considered villainous. His quirk was a form of mind control. A chuckle of disbelief left his lips as he watched Midoriya slowly creep towards the edge of the arena, letting out a loud cheer for Shinsou. Right as Midoriya was about to reach the bounds of the arena, Shinsou lost his grip on the boy somehow. A blast of air caused a gust of sand to cover the arena, briefly blocking out the camera's view of the scene. When the dust settled, Shinsou was staring at Midoriya in disbelief, the latter cradling a broken finger. Wilbur had to admit he was impressed by Midoriya. Once both boys were over their shock, Midoriya was the first to act. He dashed towards Shinsou, aiming a punch at the boy's chest. Shinsou was quick to dodge, ducking down under the other's arm and attempting to swipe his feet out from under him. As the two kept dodging each other's blows, it was clear Midoriya was going to end up winning. Shinsou was out of breath and slightly slower than the hero student. It took one stumble from the teen and a well-placed punch from Midoriya to send the boy flying out of bounds, Nimiri announcing Midoriya as the winner. Even though Shinsou might not have won, Wilbur still loudly cheered for him. It didn't matter who won. Shinsou had proven himself as a worthy opponent, especially since he was from general education. As the next match started, Wilbur left his booth, wanting to go find Shinsou and Midoriya to congratulate them on their match. He hummed to himself as he walked through the halls, once again finding himself a little bit lost. Man, he really should have gotten a map of this place. Trying to remember where to go, he didn't notice somebody else coming to walk besides him, a tall figure suddenly towering next to him. The soft crackling of fire is what made Wilbur notice he wasn't alone. Wilbur wasn't sure who the man was, but something about him already rubbed him the wrong way. The man was practically glaring at the air in front of him like it had personally wronged him, his entire posture tight and tense. "Did your favorite not make it to the finals?" Wilbur asked, just trying to make small talk. Clearly that was the wrong thing to say, as the man loudly scoffed. Of course my son made it to the finals. He's going to win this entire thing. He's better than all those other snot-nosed kids. I trained him myself after all. The man's proud smirk gave Wilbur the urge to kick him, but he kept it in. Who's your kid? Wilbur asked. It wouldn't surprise him if this was Bakugo's father, but something told him that Bakugo's issues didn't stem from his parents. Shoto, of course. Who else would he have gotten his flames from? The man grinned. Wilbur frowned, some of the pieces coming together in his mind. He hadn't seen Todoroki use his flames once so far, and with how much of an asshole this man was turning out to be, Wilbur fully understood why he wouldn't want to use them. If Phil had been as much of a dick as this guy was, Wilbur wouldn't have ever considered touching an elytra ever in his life. Oh, you're Todoroki's father. Yeah, I think he'll make it pretty far. He's one of the top of his class, so he's got them beat for the most part. I don't know much about 1B, so I can't say if he has them beat. Wilbur shrugged, even if that wasn't fully true. He was pretty sure Todoroki could take on any of the 1B kids, but didn't want to tell that to the smug man standing beside him. The taller man scoffed. My boy can defeat them with his eyes closed. He's going to be the new number 1. He's going to surpass All Might, he exclaimed, making Wilbur sigh. Why was everyone so obsessed with being the number 1 hero? Shouldn't it be more important to save people? Maybe he will. Shouldn't be his main focus though. Saving people is more important than some title, Wilbur bitterly remarked, meeting the man's gaze for just a moment. He offered him a sharp smile, stopping in front of the door leading to the waiting area meant for the students. If his main drive to be a hero is to be the number 1, he should quit when he still can. Good heroes aren't in it for the fame. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check up on my students. With that, he left the now seething man behind in the hallway, feeling pretty satisfied with himself. A defeated-looking Shinsou sat on one of the benches in the room, looking down at his hands like they had done something terrible to him. Wilbur quietly made his way over to the boy, his years of practice making his movements near inaudible. He reached out to ruffle Shinsou's hair, chuckling when the boy jumped. What's with the long face, kid? I think you did pretty fucking great. He grinned, plopping down next to Shinsou. The teen frowned, avoiding Wilbur's gaze. I lost. I fucked it all up. I should have trained more. I'll never make it into the hero course now. Shinsou's voice trembled, though whether it was from frustration or disappointment Wilbur couldn't tell. You didn't fuck anything up, kid. You did amazing. I'm proud of you. Now stop with that self-deprecating crap. You should be celebrating. Making it to the 3rd round is a feat of itself. He patted Shinsou's arm, grinning at the boy. I know that it's disappointing that you didn't win and that you're searching for a reason why you didn't, but maybe there isn't a reason, it just happened. Don't let it kill your spirits. Use it to motivate yourself to train harder. I can help you out, if you want. As the newest UA teacher, I can maybe show you some of the exercises 1A uses to train. Then you'll be just as prepared as them for the next festival. So chin up, kid. The world doesn't end just because you lost. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. Life wouldn't be interesting anymore if you always won. He chuckled, hoping to lighten the boy's spirits a bit. Shinsou wryly smiled as he wiped his eyes, nodding a bit. Since when are you a teacher here? I thought you had died, man. You didn't show up for 2 weeks. Shinsou questioned, raising a brow at the older male. Wilbur sheepishly laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's complicated. I'll explain it later. All that matters is that I'm officially a teacher's assistant for 1A, though that's only until Eraserhead is all healed up. Not sure what happens after that, but I'll cross that bridge when I get to it, I suppose. They ended up leaving the waiting area together, parting ways at their respective booths. Shinsou joined his class, and from what Wilbur could hear, he got a warm welcome from them. Wilbur was proud of the boy, and was glad his classmates seemingly shared the same sentiment. Settling back down in his own booth, he had returned just in time to hear the lineups for the 2nd round. Most had predictable outcomes, but one stood out to Wilbur. Midoriya versus Todoroki, 2 kids who were both considered part of the top of 1A. While Wilbur predicted that Todoroki would probably win, he could tell this was going to be an interesting match. The second the starting signal was given, the 2 went at it. Ice and gusts of wind caused by Midoriya's punches flew through the arena, making it hard to follow who exactly had the upper hand. The few glimpses Wilbur got of Midoriya, the boy seemed to be yelling something at Todoroki, causing the boy to look conflicted. It truly was a shame there were no microphones around, because Wilbur was dying to know what was being said. The short boy's words seemed to have hit their target, as Todoroki unleashed his flames, taking out most of the ice around him. Wilbur leaned forwards in his seat, fascinated by the turn of events. What had Midoriya said to finally make Todoroki use his fire? Had it been something regarding his father? Just the idea of the man made Wilbur want to gag. He made a mental note to ask Midoriya about it on a later date. As Todoroki took a step forward to launch an attack with his newly found power, Midoriya collapsed to the floor, too exhausted to continue to fight. As Todoroki was declared the winner, Recovery Girl was brought out to help Midoriya. even though he had won. Todoroki didn't look all too victorious, the frown on his face making him look more like the losing party than the winning. The longer the festival went on, the more questions Wilbur had about Todoroki. The next few matches were probably very interesting. But Wilbur couldn't bring himself to pay much attention. His mind was racing, coming up with possible theories and reasonings for what had just happened. Letting his mind run wild was never a very smart decision, because within no time he was thinking about things he had been avoiding, like how much Uraraka had reminded him of Nikki during her fight against Bakugo, and how the crowd had underestimated her just like how everybody had underestimated Nikki during her time under Schlatt's rule. He thought about how much Tommy, Tubbo, and Fundy would have probably loved watching this festival. How Schlatt and Quackity would have made wonderful hosts for an event like this. A sigh escaped his lips as he rubbed his cheeks a bit. He was pulled out of his thoughts as Midnight announced the final round's participants, Todoroki versus Bakugo. Now, Wilbur liked to think he was a very pragmatic and reasonable man, and logically he knew these two kids were pretty evenly tied. Problem was, Wilbur was an incredibly petty man, and therefore chose to believe that Todoroki was definitely going to beat Bakugo just because. He only half-watched the match, believing he already knew the outcome. Turns out, he was very wrong. Bakugo managed to beat Todoroki, making him the winner of the tournament. While Wilbur was a bit salty about it since he didn't really believe Bakugo deserved to win, he still clapped and cheered for the boy nonetheless. Turns out Wilbur wasn't the only one who didn't think the explosive teen was the fair winner, the student himself complaining the loudest that it wasn't a fair match since half and half didn't give his all. A muzzle was placed on Bakugo somewhere along the way before the winner's ceremony, which made Wilbur's stomach twist. Sure, Bakugo was a prick in every sense of the word, but silencing him with a muzzle live on air felt incredibly wrong. The entire ceremony felt awkward, literally every student on the podium looking like they would rather be somewhere else. Even All Might himself looked awkward as he hung the medals around the students' necks. Walking out of the arena about half an hour later, Wilbur couldn't help but feel like the entire day had been surreal. Watching a bunch of kids fight each other for entertainment felt wrong. A brief flash of the pit made him shake his head, not wanting to think about it. He regretted pushing Tommy to fight Techno. The boy had been rightfully upset. Wilbur saw that now. Back then, he hadn't been thinking straight. He made a lot of mistakes, most of them causing a lot of pain to those around him. He wished he could change what he had done, but it was too late now. Kicking against a stray can, Wilbur shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans with a sigh. How was he supposed to make up for what he had done in the past when the people he had hurt weren't even on this server? Was he just supposed to feel bad about it until he died again? That felt stupid. His little mental rant was interrupted by a soft noise coming from a nearby trash can. Looking around for a moment, he hesitantly approached it. Peering inside revealed a small curled-up kitten, meowing like its life depended on it. By the looks of it, it had been in there for a while, looking incredibly frail and small. Wilbur carefully scooped the animal into his hands, bringing it close to his chest. "SHH, I got you, mate. It's okay. Let's get you somewhere warm," he cooed to the animal, smiling as the kitten leaned into his hands. The kitten turned out to be a girl, who Wilbur named Friend. He wasn't quite sure why he had chosen the name, to be honest. It had just been the first one to come to mind that he liked. She was a tabby cat, with intricate stripes running all down her back. One of her eyes was missing, the other being an almost emerald green color. Wilbur had fed her some of his leftovers, which the kitten had happily eaten before zooming around the house. As he watched Friend race around his living room, his chest felt a bit lighter, his earlier worries resting on him just a bit lighter. Maybe he could heal here. Wilbur was slowly starting to get used to the UA layout, getting lost a lot less frequently. He could now get to the teacher's lounge without having to ask for directions, a fact he was pretty proud of. He had never been the best at navigating. That title belonged to Techno, the human GPS blade. Why bother learning how to navigate when he could just drag Techno along to do it for him? As he walked into the teacher's lounge, Midnight was quick to make her way over to him. "Sud, just the man I was looking for. 1A are picking their hero names today. And since Eraserhead is boring, I need somebody else to help me supervise," she explained to him, giving him her best attempt at pleading eyes. Sadly, they didn't work on Wilbur, who had grown up having to say no to both Tommy's and Tubbo's puppy dog eyes. "Are you sure I'm the right person for the job? I don't even have a hero name," Wilbur questioned, crossing his arms across his chest. Midnight blinked, clearly a bit taken aback by that information. "Even better, you can pick one out too. No part of the UA staff can go without a hero name," she exclaimed, already having made up her mind. Wilbur sighed and decided to just go along with it. Picking a hero name didn't sound all too bad. 1A was as rowdy as ever as the two teachers entered the classroom. Wilbur was about to head to his own desk when Midnight stopped him. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, chuckling to herself as she handed him a stack of whiteboards. "Could you hand these out for me?" Wilbur nodded, quickly getting to work. He pointedly ignored the glare Bakugo threw his way, though every inch of him was screaming for him to flip the boy off. Once every student had a little whiteboard, Midnight started to explain the plan for today. A few kids were already starting to write, most probably already knowing what name they wanted. Wilbur shifted his weight between his feet, feeling a bit awkward just standing at the front of the classroom. Midnight didn't seem to share this sentiment, looking confident as ever as she rested her hands on her hips. In some funny way, Midnight reminded Wilbur of Quackity. Now that he thought about it, those two would probably get along swimmingly. He got lost in his own thoughts for a moment, flashes of memories involving Quackity flooding his mind. From before the election, when Wilbur had stubbornly announced that Quackity wasn't allowed to run. Thinking back on it, he regretted being so harsh to the man. The duck hybrid's intentions had been good. Neither they had been better than Wilbur's if the man was truly honest with himself. He had caused Quackity a lot of grief, especially when his actions inadvertently led to the election of Schlatt. The pain that man had caused to both Tubbo and Quackity was something Wilbur would never forgive himself for. He should have never fallen for the Ram hybrid's tricks. Shaking his head a bit, he tried to shake off the heavy feeling pushing down on his stomach. Guilt wasn't going to make his actions any less terrible. Casting a quick look around the classroom, he realized kids were already presenting their hero names. He hadn't caught a singular one yet, but just mimicked Midnight's behavior. This couldn't keep happening. Why did the smallest of things make him lose grip of what was happening in the moment? They cycled through most students rather quickly, their names usually getting approved on their first or second attempt. Only a few were lagging behind. Todoroki, who hadn't presented any name yet, Bakugo, who was on his fifth attempt but his name's just kind of sucked in, Ada, who looked a bit conflicted. Now that Wilbur thought about it, he hadn't seen the kid at the winner's ceremony during the festival even though the boy had placed shared third. Most names were pretty fitting of the kids. Midoriya surprised Wilbur a bit. Picking a name that was once used to belittle him and turning it into his hero name to reclaim it was a power move. Though Wilbur couldn't help but wonder who had used the name against him in the first place. Judging by the scowl on a certain somebody's features, Wilbur thought he might know the culprit. Todoroki ended up just going with his first name for his hero name, which Midnight didn't seem to support. Wilbur liked it, and voiced his approval for the name. With a quirk as flashy as yours, having a simple name works, he commented, grinning at the small smile Todoroki shot his way. Progress. Ada was up next, announcing his hero name was going to be Ingenium. Wilbur didn't know the significance, but it seemed important to the kid. Since Bakugo was refusing to pick a normal name, his hero name was left blank for the time being. While it had been fun to listen to everybody's names, Wilbur was more than ready to end the class so he could maybe get a nap in before his meeting with Nezu later. Midnight seemed to have other plans, a wicked smile on her lips as she spoke. All right, now that you all have picked your hero names, it's time to help your dear teacher pick one. You see, Sid over here doesn't have a hero name, and we can't have that now, can we? Wilbur shot the woman a glare, softly sighing to himself as the class burst into a wave of suggestions. Most were just plain shit, like Video Game Man and TNT Man. Wilbur instantly shot those down. He might not have a whole lot going for him, but he was better than that. As he listened to more and more silly name suggestions, a sigh left his lips. Hearing so many names thrown his way reminded him of how Technoblade used to give people the wildest nicknames based on old Greek mythology. Why the piglin had been so obsessed with mythology, Wilbur didn't know. What he did know was that back in Pictopia, Technoblade had told him one particular tale that had stuck with him for some reason. As much as I appreciate your suggestions, I think I've made up my mind. One of my friends used to tell me I reminded him of Phaethon from Greek mythology. It's got a nice ring to it, I think. Phaethon, the hero who isn't actually a hero, Wilbur announced, scribbling the name down on the whiteboard that had been pushed into his hands during Midnight's announcement. The class fell silent for a minute, making Wilbur's skin itch. He hated the amount of eyes on him, picking apart the name that meant a lot to him. I think it's a cool name, Mr. Soot. Midoriya was the first one to break the silence, stumbling over his own words a bit. Wilbur relaxed a bit as more students voiced their agreement. He put the board down, briefly looking over at Midnight to make sure she agreed with it. Seeing the almost worried expression on her features made him realize she must know the tale of Phaethon. And now he would have to explain just why exactly his friends saw him as a kid who wanted to make his father proud but ended up messing up so bad that he died for it. Sometimes, Wilbur really wished he knew when to shut up. As the class finally came to an end, Wilbur was quick to make his way to the teacher's lounge. Midnight didn't follow, presumably heading to the cafeteria first. He let out a sigh in relief as he flopped down on the couch that he by now had practically claimed. Most days he could be found napping on it in between classes. A chuckle came from beside him, startling the crap out of him. He took a deep breath as he calmed himself, turning to look at the bear standing next to the couch. I did not mean to startle you, my apologies. I just wanted to see how you were doing. It must be quite the challenge to adjust to being a teacher. Nezu climbed up on the couch to sit beside Wilbur, the taller of the pair scooting aside a bit to give the bear some space. It's unlike anything I've ever done before. Sure, I've been somewhat of a mentor figure to some kids before, but never have I been like a proper teacher. Nether, I wasn't even a good mentor. Taught them pain more than anything. Wilbur ran a hand down his face, feeling somewhat relieved to get to share his problems without fearing being judged. I see. I heard you picked out a hero name. Nezu changed the topic, which Wilbur appreciated. He softly hummed to himself, looking down at his hands. It's a name Technoblade gave me right before. You know, the whole boom situation. Phaethon. Apparently, the myth goes that he begged his father to ride some kind of sun chariot to make his father proud. He crashed it rather horribly, and ended up causing a lot of pain and suffering. As a punishment, he was killed. Techno said it fit me, since I just wanted to make Phil proud, you know. He started countless nations and always managed to keep them up and running. Almanberg was supposed to be my piece de resistance, my attempt at sticking it to the man and making it work. Look how that worked out for me. Wilbur let out a wry chuckle. I think your father would be proud of you if he could see you know, Wilbur. Nezu stated it with so much confidence that it made Wilbur tear up. You are a good man. You made some mistakes, but those do not define you. Living in the past will make you miserable, but forcing yourself to move on will not make you feel any better either. My door is always open for you. With that, the beat slid off of the couch, playfully saluting the man before leaving Wilbur alone with his thoughts. Drawing his legs up to his chest, Wilbur buried his nose in his knees. His tears soaked the rough fabric of his jeans, though he couldn't bring himself to care. He allowed himself to think for a while, remembering the letters he wrote to his father, how he had lied, just to spare his father's feelings. Phil didn't have to know just how terribly Wilbur had fucked everything up. Had he just not stopped writing, Phil wouldn't have had to see Wilbur at his worst. He wouldn't have been forced to stab his own son. Fuck, what had he done? Maybe it was better that he was stuck here. Now he at least couldn't hurt his own family anymore. Wilbur woke up with the weird feeling that something was wrong. He couldn't quite place what was causing the discomfort. He just felt a vague sense of dread hang over him all morning. Since there wasn't much he could do about it, he let it be for the time being. Today was a big day. The students were picking their internships today. According to Eraserhead, this was pretty important. Wilbur wouldn't know. He didn't really know what an internship was in the first place. Wilbur's stomach still felt heavy as he wandered into the teacher's lounge. Taking a quick look around, he couldn't spot anything that could be causing it. He wasn't nervous, nor was he really experiencing any other emotion than dread and confusion. Was he getting sick? It wouldn't surprise him if his body finally decided to break down. It had been rough a lot lately. Checking his hearts, he didn't see anything up with them either. No weird effects, no withered hearts, nothing. Figuring out what was causing him to be on edge was getting more and more annoying as Wilbur struggled to pinpoint the cause. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he realized he was one of the first teachers to arrive. Back on the Dream SMP, Wilbur had never been the type to show up early. Not that he was always late. No, he did quite the opposite actually. Wilbur was a man who liked to show up right on time. Not a minute earlier or later. Punctuality was important, he had once claimed to Tommy. Now, he could see it had just been a shitty attempt at feeling in control. Deciding when the meeting would happen and strictly sticking to that time made him feel powerful in some sick way. Thinking about it, it really was quite depressing how a thing as small as punctuality was the only thing that made him feel in control. His train of thought halted as Eraserhead walked past him, the man reaching for the coffee can as he gave his assistant a nod. Wilbur had come to realize Aizawa wasn't a man of many words, oftentimes responding in nonverbal cues. The longer Wilbur spent with the man, the more he became confident that Technoblade and Aizawa would probably make good friends. Good morning to you too, Mr. Aizawa. Wilbur offered the man a smile, only receiving a tired-sounding grunt in response. Rough night, he laughed, taking another sip from his coffee as he watched Aizawa down most of his own in one go. Aizawa's lips were moving, but Wilbur couldn't hear him over the ringing that was forming in his ears. It drowned out all his surroundings, a wave of dizziness accompanying the disorienting noises. He stumbled backwards, trying to regain his balance. Somewhere along the way, the cup in his hand slipped. As ceramic shattered against the floor, Wilbur's skin started to feel like he was being torn apart. Every fiber of his being felt like it was on fire. A pain-filled groan left his throat as he crumpled to the floor. Eyes scrunched closed as the distorted noises started to ease up. Drawing in a few rough breaths, he forced his eyes open, only to be met with unfamiliar sights surrounding him. Wilbur, a familiar voice called out, Wilbur's head snapping towards the source of the noise. There stood Phil's a Minecraft in all his glory, shielding Wilbur from the rain with his wing. Dad, how am I here? I'm back. I can't be back, this isn't right. It hurts, Wilbur coughed, his body still aching. Phil looked like he had so much to say, but couldn't bring himself to say anything. Besides him stood Arid, Tommy, and somebody Wilbur couldn't recognize. "Wilbur, is that really you?" Tommy's voice made Wilbur want to sob. He had missed the boy so much. A pained smile formed on his lips as he nodded a bit. "Yeah, it's me, Toms, the one and only Wilby Soot." He tried to joke, but his laughter only caused more pain. It worked. "I can't believe it." Arid's voice caught Wilbur a bit off guard, confused as to why the monarch was there in the first place. Something was clearly going on, but the pain and disorientation Wilbur was experiencing made it hard to figure out just what it was. They all looked at him so expectantly, like they wanted a speech or something. Another wave of fire shot through Wilbur's body, a painful cough shaking up his already trembling frame. I don't think I have much time here, but bloody hell, this hurts, but I'm sorry, okay? Really, I'm so fucking sorry, and I know that doesn't fix shit, but maybe one day I can actually make up for it. I don't know what you did, but please don't, this hurts so bad, worse than dying if I'm honest." While he tried to give them the speech they had so clearly been after, Wilbur didn't get to finish his final words to his family, the same wave of distortion rolling over him before he could. The lappy's blue walls faded into static. The silhouette of his worried father and devastated little brother burnt into his retinas as he was thrown through what felt like the void. He came back to on the floor. An almost panicked-looking Aizawa bowed over him, trying to catch his breath. He sat up a bit, forcing the other teacher to back up a bit. "What the hell just happened, Soot? You disappeared for a solid minute." He sounded like he was scolding a student, which would have made Wilbur laugh had he not been on the verge of breaking down. I don't know. I was just drinking my coffee, and suddenly I'm face to face with my dad and brother, who are looking at me like I just died. I tried to talk to them, but it hurt so much." Wilbur's voice trembled as he spoke, hands clutching his shirt just above where he was stabbed. "You saw your father?" Aizawa questioned, clearly a bit lost. Wilbur hesitantly nodded, a painful cough racking through his shoulders. "Yeah, when I left, we weren't on, let's say, the best terms," he softly admitted, flashes of Phil's silent tears making his heart ache. I need some air." He pushed himself up to his feet, trying to act like he wasn't shaking like a leaf. Aizawa looked like he wanted to protest, but didn't speak up. Wilbur stumbled out of the lounge, rushing into the nearest empty classroom. Locking the door behind him, he let himself sink down against the door. What the hell had just happened? He mentally recounted everything he remembered. 1 second, he was just chatting with Aizawa. The next, he was standing on some kind of lappy's platform surrounded by 2 people he considered his family, a traitor and a stranger. He vaguely remembered some of the details of the area, like something resembling a Elmanberg flag hanging in the background, a few brewing stands, a blue sheep. It made no sense to him. Sinking his fingers into his hair, he tried to calm down his erratic breathing. It must have been a glitch of some kind. Yeah, a glitch. He wasn't supposed to be allowed to go back there, right? This was supposed to be his new home server. He was doing well here. People were counting on him. He couldn't be sent back. Not now. Horror struck him when he realized what he had been thinking, eyes widening as he pressed his hands over his mouth to keep himself from sobbing. He didn't want to go back to the dream SMP. Just the idea alone terrified him. He wasn't ready to face his mistakes yet. This realization led to a few other realizations, like that he really was selfish since Phil and Tommy had clearly been happy to have him back, and that the universe hated him. It took Wilbur 20 minutes to calm down his breathing, though his hands were still shaking by the time he finally got up from the floor. He paced around the classroom, just to busy himself with something other than thinking. It didn't help much, his mind still a mess of emotions, memories, and worries. Phantom pains kept shooting through his chest, the by now gone stab wound aching like it was fresh. Gently wiping his eyes with his sleeve, Wilbur sighed. He was so tired. Things were finally starting to look up for him. He had a job, some friends. Neither he was even gaining some respect within multiple different communities. Everything had been going so well. But of course, something had to go wrong. The universe just had to remind him he didn't belong here, that this wasn't his home. No matter how much more at home he felt here, it was hopeful to assume he was allowed to stay here. Someday, an admin would notice he wasn't whitelisted, and he'd go wherever permanently dead players go. He'd join Schlatt in the void. But until that day came, until an admin personally decided to ban him, Wilbur was going to make the most out of his second chance, even if he was on borrowed time. Maybe next time Phil, Tommy, Arid, and the mystery person decided to do a botched resurrection, he'd be ready to face them, to face his past. But until then, all he could do was try to become a better man. When they were younger, when Elmanberg was still but a fun adventure they had started to piss off Dream, Tommy had always referred to Phil as the best man alive. Wilbur had always agreed his father could do no wrong in his eyes. But Wilbur was older now, and he now understood Phil was just a man trying his best. Don't get him wrong, Phil was a wonderful dad, but he didn't always get Wilbur. He didn't get Wilbur's need for approval, didn't notice the signs of his son slipping before it was too late. His goal had always been to be more like Phil's in Minecraft, because that would ultimately make him a better person. But these days, Wilbur didn't want to mirror his father. He loved the man dearly, but mistakes had been made, and they hurt. They would for a while. Maybe one day they would stop aching. No, instead Wilbur found himself wanting to be more like the people on this server. Not like the heroes everybody wanted to be like, but more like the people he had met. More like the heroes who put their lives on the line just to save the lives of strangers. More like the teachers who put so much time into helping the next generation to be the best version of themselves. The villains who were just trying to do the right thing in a world with the cards so stacked against them. They were the people who inspired Wilbur. Those not afraid to help others. Those not afraid to speak up under injustices. Those who changed history. That's all Wilbur wanted in life. To be remembered and to make a difference. He still had a lot to learn, and this server was the best place for him to do so. He couldn't leave just yet. Phil and Tommy just had to hold on tight for a little while longer. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Wilbur not mentally present for most of it. He was pretty shaken up by the whole failed resurrection, and it didn't help that Aizawa kept looking at him with an almost worried expression. He had never seen the man show this much emotion before, and he hated the fact that he was the cause of it. Even some of the students seemed to have picked up on it, if the quick glances shot his way all throughout the day were anything to go off of. "Soot, we need to talk," Aizawa called out as the students filtered out of the classroom, brows furrowed as he looked at Wilbur. Sighing to himself, Wilbur resigned to his fate and walked up to the man's desk, leaning against it. "If this is about this morning, I already told you I don't know what happened," he murmured, pointedly looking out of the window to avoid looking at the other man. "No, it's not that. It's about the internships. My agency has offered a spot to a student who has decided to take the offer. I wanted to ask you if you would be interested in helping out. It's not like there will be anything for you to do here at UA during that week anyways," Aizawa explained as he sorted through some papers on his desk. Wilbur blinked a few times, looking back at the teacher. "Oh, who would this student be, if I may ask?" he asked. "Shinsou Itoshi, the kid from Gen Ed who went against Midoriya." Wilbur's features pulled into an expression of surprise. "Shinsou is interning under you." "Oh hell yeah, I'll help out. He's a good kid, you'll love him." Wilbur grinned, glad the teen was finally getting the chance to prove himself. "You know him?" Aizawa asked, brows knitting together in confusion. A chuckle escaped Wilbur's lips as he nodded. "We worked at the same cafe for a while. Didn't know his quirk was that cool though. He never told me what it was." "I get why he didn't. Some people here are bloody weird about certain quirk types, man," he explained, realizing a bit too late his wording might have been a bit odd. Aizawa didn't seem to notice, moving on as if Wilbur didn't accidentally make him sound like an alien trying to blend in among humans for the first time. 10 to 10 to 10. Wilbur wasn't quite sure what he had expected Aizawa's internship plan to be, but he certainly hadn't thought it would just be him putting Shinsou through so much training. It made Wilbur wonder how the teen was still able to stand. The first day, Wilbur had watched the duo spar for most of the day, refusing to participate. He didn't want a repeat of what had happened during that training exercise a few weeks ago. Aizawa had already seen too much. One more panic attack around the man and Wilbur would have to start coming up with a better excuse than "me and my dad were arguing before I left." The second day, Wilbur did get to participate. Aizawa wanted to teach Shinsou how to get around the city faster, which meant most of the day was spent trying to teach the kid the basics of parkouring. While Wilbur had never been an amazing parkourist, he wasn't horrible at it either. But apparently everybody was shit at parkour on this server, since Aizawa seemed genuinely impressed as Wilbur leaped from platform to platform. He played it off as being part of his quirk, since after all most video games use some form of platforming, so it made sense he was good at jumping around. If Aizawa had his doubts about the explanation, he didn't voice them, simply asking Wilbur to show Shinsou how to do a particular jump once more. Day 3 was another sparring day, though this time both Aizawa and Shinsou were using what Wilbur had been told was a capturing weapon. To him, it just looked like a fancy scarf that could move, but hey, he wasn't one to judge. Wilbur again chose to watch, though he had an actual reason to do so. Nezu had given him a stack of paperwork he needed to look through. What it was about, he hadn't been told, just that it was important. A yellow sticky note was tacked on top of the first page of the stack of papers, which Wilbur ripped off before reading it. "Sign all of these, and read them over, Nezu." Wilbur wasn't sure why, but the sight of that oh-so-familiar smiley made his stomach tense up. Now that he came to think about it, he hadn't really thought about Dream at all since arriving here. A man who had such an influence on his life had been so easily forgotten. The idea alone made Wilbur chuckle. Dream would probably have lost his mind if he ever came to know he was that easily forgotten. Wilbur and Dream had an odd relationship, to say the least. On paper, they were supposed to be arch-rivals, one posing as the good guy who wanted nothing more than freedom for his people, and the other posing as the bad guy who refused to let go of the power he possessed. In reality, things were a lot less black and white than they seemed. Dream was not necessarily the only bad guy, nor was Wilbur the true good guy. They were both after the same thing, but used very different strategies to get what they wanted. Dream used brute force. Whether that meant starting actual wars or striking up deals in pacts, it all came down to Dream using his power and influence for his own gain. Wilbur didn't have that power to bank off of. No, he had to build himself up, had to find ways to legitimize his power before he could do anything. Wilbur used subtlety and diplomacy. Words were sometimes more powerful than swords, especially when he didn't have the best fighting skills to begin with. Their approaches might have been different, but they had the same goal, and they were both aware of this fact too. Dream hadn't given Wilbur the TNT out of the goodness of his heart. He took advantage of Wilbur's obsession with wanting to get rid of Elmanberg, to both knock out the country that had been a thorn in his side from the beginning, and to further the unrest within Pigtopia. It was brilliant. Wilbur could admit that now looking back on it. Dream had known Tommy wouldn't agree with the plan, creating tension within the already weak faction. He knew that even if Pigtopia won, there was no chance it would last long given the already strained relationships. He played Wilbur, and Wilbur played right along. Idly, Wilbur wondered if Dream had always meant for him to die that day, or if that had been a surprise to him too. Sure, Dream would have known that Phil was arriving, but Wilbur doubted anyone could have anticipated that the winged man would drive a sword through his son's chest that same day. He couldn't even remember whether Dream was still around by the time the explosion went off, though he didn't think so. The masked man knew exactly when Wilbur was going to hit the button, so he probably got his men out of there the second he noticed Wilbur excusing himself from the celebration speech. Elmanberg had been his attempt at getting the power he deep down had believed he deserved. When it became clear those he trusted clearly didn't want him to have that power, he became obsessed with the idea that if he couldn't have it, nobody could. It was such a selfish idea. He now saw that everybody had rightfully not trusted him with power. Schlatt hadn't been a good president either, but he would have never become president had Wilbur just listened to those around him. He should have just allowed Quackity to run, should have never brought on Schlatt, should have never accepted the TNT. Soot, lunch break. Come on, I know you're not actually doing anything. You've been staring at that page for 2 hours now. Aizawa's voice drew him out of his spiral, flinching as he came back to reality. Right, yes, sorry, been daydreaming a bit. I'll come in a second, don't wait for me, he assured with a small smile. He watched the duo hesitantly leave, a sigh leaving his throat. Looking down at the smiley that had caused Wilbur's thoughts to run wild, he crumbled up the note. As he left the training hall, he tossed the little ball of paper in the trash. On his way home after the 4th day of Shinsou's internship, Wilbur ran into some trouble. The day itself had been pretty uneventful, just more sparring and a bit more of Parker training. Aizawa wasn't going easy on the teenager, and the kid was doing his best to keep up. During the few times Wilbur helped out, he made sure to tone it down a bit. Shinsou was good, but not good enough to leap from rooftop to rooftop without some guidance just yet. He was pretty sure Aizawa knew by now that Wilbur was taking it easy on the teen, but just hadn't brought it up yet. Or maybe he didn't quite believe Shinsou was ready yet either. Wilbur had decided to take the long route home, just wanting to stretch his legs a bit. Sure, doing the same jump 15 times just to show Shinsou exactly how to do it was technically also stretching his leg, but it just didn't feel the same as walking through the cold streets of the city at night with the only light being the way too bright streetlights. Wilbur reckoned staring into one of those fuckers for too long could definitely cause somebody to gain a permanent blindness effect. He was about 4 blocks away from his house when he heard it, an inhuman-sounding shriek tearing through the air. The only sound that Wilbur knew that came even close to what he had just heard was that of a phantom swooping down, though this sounded a lot more fierce. It sounded familiar, though he couldn't place where he had heard it before. His feet moved before he could think, hands already opening up his inventory to grab his bow. What he came face to face with was indeed familiar. A Nama was wreaking havoc downtown, attacking civilians as multiple heroes tried to stop it. From a distance, Wilbur spotted Endeavor amongst the heroes. He briefly considered just turning around, since, well, he didn't really feel like working together with that man. That thought made him freeze in his spot. Was he really about to let civilians get hurt just because he found Endeavor a bit of a prick? Fuck, this server was starting to get to him. He might not be a hero, but he for a moment understood why some heroes didn't always intervene, and he sincerely wished to never understand it again. He took aim, firing a series of weakness arrows at the Namo. 2 hit, which made Wilbur feel rather victorious. If his shaky hands could still aim a bow, there was still a chance for him. The creature screeched as the arrow's potion dip tips kicked in. Where it had been visibly healing from every injury before, it now could barely bat its wings. Wilbur let out a cackle as he approached the heroes, glaring up at the Namu who was rapidly crashing to the ground. "Take that, you overgrown bat. God, I hate those fuckers," he exclaimed, ignoring the looks he was getting. As he slid his bow back in this inventory, Endeavor approached him. "There's more of them all over town. I need to go after my son." He ran off when the Namu appeared. He made it sound like an order, like Wilbur was supposed to go out and fight the other ones while Endeavor went after his runaway kid. The problem was, of course, that nobody told Wilbur, "If you say I can't do the thing, I'll just start a nation so I can do the thing." So what to do? So of course Wilbur tailed the hero. It wasn't like it was hard. The man was built like a truck and had literal fire for a beard. He could follow the man by scent alone. If anyone knew the scent of fire, it was Wilbur. At any given time on the Dream SMP, it could be guaranteed that at least one building was on fire. Arson was such a regular occurrence that it was rarely even seen as a crime. When everybody did it, it wasn't really a crime anymore. Turns out Todoroki had encountered more than just a Namu. Wilbur arrived at the scene a few moments after Endeavor, but he could gather the basics of what had happened based on the absolute state of the area. Ice covered most of the alleyway, along with random slashes that looked like they came from a sword. There were multiple pools of blood as he walked through the poorly lit area, making his nose scrunch up a bit. He approached the group of heroes, students and sidekicks, curious as to what had happened. A half-dead-looking man was sitting tied up behind the group, making Wilbur assume that man must have been the villain the students faced off against. He looked the part, plus the two swords on his back seemed to match the slash marks Wilbur had noticed. Wilbur was about to ask what was going on, when that by now familiar shrieking once again tore through the air. Within the blink of an eye, a Namu had snatched up Midoriya. One moment, the villain-looking guy was sat tied up. The next, he's plunging a knife into the Namu's exposed brain. The heroes around him were in a similar state of shock as the monster crashed to the ground. The villain and hero in training going down with it. This society is overgrown with fake heroes and criminals who wave their power around idly. They should be purged. The man's voice sounded like one would expect a criminal to sound, almost making Wilbur want to scoff. As he listened to the man rant about how truly corrupt all heroes were and how the only true hero was All Might, he couldn't stop the sigh from leaving his lungs. The villain was delusional at best, and Wilbur would know. It takes one to know one. As he approached the man, he realized nobody else was moving. It confused him a bit, until he noticed how even the pro heroes around looked absolutely terrified, like this villain was so much more terrifying than the Nomus they had faced earlier. Wilbur didn't see it. "You make quite the showman, but I don't buy it. Come on, you want me to believe in a world with over 7 billion people there's only one hero with decent morals? You really believe every single hero out there is in it for the cash? Or, corrupted in your words, don't you hear how batshit that sounds, man?" Wilbur questioned, a chuckle leaving his throat when the villain had the audacity to look surprised that somebody had challenged his bold claims. "Sure, some heroes are bad, don't get me wrong, but who are you to decide who is and isn't good? Because from where I stand, you sound like a guy with a god complex who thinks he's the only enlightened one sent down to rid the world of evil. Which, funnily enough, is how a lot of those heroes you hate so much also see themselves. If your ideology fundamentally is the same as that of those you claim are sinners, doesn't that make you a sinner too?" Wilbur didn't care if the smile on his lips was slightly unhinged. He was having too much fun seeing the conflicted feelings play out across the villain's features. That was when he realized why nobody else was moving. Before Wilbur had spoken up, the villain had been putting out such a bloodlust that it must have scared the group. Now that he thought about it, he hadn't really felt anybody with such a heavy aura around them in this server before. Unfortunately for the villain, Wilbur grew up with Technoblade, who had such a heavy bloodlust that he was literally dubbed the Blood God. The amount of times Wilbur woke up to find Phil once again trying to tame an almost feral Technoblade would probably be considered alarming on this server. They are the true evil. They are sinners who have corrupted the world. The villain tried, but Wilbur didn't buy it. If a few rotten apples managed to corrupt the entire world, it wasn't them. There are clearly fundamental issues that you don't want to acknowledge since you're not really here to change the world. Now are you? You have a personal score to settle. Stop hiding behind some bigger cause bullshit and just admit you want to kill heroes because you feel wronged by them. If you actually wanted to do some good, you would have stuck out for the people who are actively being affected by the way society functions instead of going after the people who are just trying to do their job. Stop being a pretentious bastard. Wilbur took another step towards the man, practically nose to nose with him now. He grinned down at him, teeth showing as he craned his neck a bit. "Awa, is the little babyman upset somebody broke through his little aura? I've felt more threatening auras while eating cereal. You ain't shit compared to the Blood God." He laughed, briefly imagining all the ways Technoblade would have already slaughtered the man in front of him within the short span of time they had been talking. Not every hero is in it for the money. Not every villain is in it to be a nuisance to society. Things aren't black and white. If you actually opened your eyes and looked around, you'd see how we're all just people trying to make shit work. Heroes, villains, and everything in between. It doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. We all eat shit and die someday. What does matter is what we make of what limited time we have here. We all leave something behind when we inevitably hit the bucket, good or bad. Do you really want your legacy to be a god complex and a trail of dead bodies? Wilbur questioned, pushing down the voice in the back of his head that reminded him that technically, that was his legacy too. As a man who knows a thing or two about doing dumb shit thinking it's for the greater good, it usually isn't. One day, you'll wake up and realize what you've done and you'll hate yourself. I'm trying to save you the pain. Just let it be, man. Find a non-violent way to make a change. Start a petition or something. He slipped out of his villain role, knowing if he stayed in that mindset too long he'd spiral. His voice wavered near the end, but he didn't let it slow him down. He opened his mouth to add onto his rant, but before he could get a word out, the villain collapsed. Blinking a few times, he looked between the body and the group behind him, who all suddenly started to move. It was like they were snapped out of whatever trance the bloodthirsty aura had forced them under. He let them handle the passed-out villain, stumbling away from the scene to catch his breath. His hands clutched his healed stab wound, nails scraping against his skin through the fabric of his shirt. He had definitely gone too far, had said too much. As he leaned against a nearby wall, he caught Todoroki's eyes, whose expression spoke volumes more than he had ever said out loud. Wilbur didn't give him any answers, couldn't give him any information without admitting to once being in the villain's spot before. So convinced he was doing the right thing, that he was ridding the world of evil without realizing the only evil was he himself. Admitting that to himself was hard enough. Actually having to tell people in this server about it was something he wasn't ready for yet. But he knew the students would have questions. Maybe he'd be able to answer them, maybe he wouldn't. Right now, all he wanted was to go home and curl up on his couch with friend and maybe cry for a while. Screaming until his throat started to go hoarse sounded like a lovely way to spend the rest of his Thursday night. Sadly, he wasn't allowed to go home just yet. They forced him to get a medical checkup. Even after he showed them his heart bar, which hadn't moved at all, showing them he was fine. After a nurse ran a bunch of tests on him he only half understood. A cop started asking him a bunch of questions he only answered to humor the man. He was dead tired, and just wanted to forget about everything that happened. That's when Wilbur ran into a slight problem. The cop asked to see his license. Wilbur pursed his lips, trying to come up with a good excuse before just giving up. I don't have one. I just rushed in to help when I realized what was going on. I didn't use my quirk though, so you know how illegal was it really? I've been told it only counts as vigilante action if I use my quirk, which I clearly didn't so. Yeah, no license. Do have a hero name though. Fathian, sounds pretty cool, right? Wilbur rambled, doing what he did best, talk his way out of things. Somehow, the cop didn't arrest him on the spot. He was let off the hook with a warning, which was a mistake on the cop's part as Wilbur was most definitely going to do the exact same thing again if the opportunity arose. By the time he was finally allowed to leave, the sun was already starting to come up. Just his luck, shooting Aizawa a quick message that he wouldn't be able to make it to work that day. Wilbur went home with the intention to sleep for the next 14 hours. 10 to 10 to 10. A man clad in a multicolored hoodie frowned as he hit repeat on his communicator, the screen showing the fight between the villain known as the Hero Killer, Stain, and a new hero only known as Fathian to the public. The video was low quality, but one could clearly hear what was being said. It wasn't necessarily the actual words being spoken that had caught the hoodie-wearing man's attention. No, it was the person who was saying them. Why was Wilbur Soot, who wasn't even supposed to be in this dimension, preaching morals to a villain? Turning off his communicator, Carl opened up his diary. Summoning up a quilt, he started to write. Entry: Wilbur is here, and he is very much not dead. Wilbur yawned as he made his way to the coffee machine, idly rubbing his cheek. Somehow, even after spending most of the weekend asleep, he still felt tired. Maybe it was just because it was Monday morning, and somehow everybody always seemed tired on Mondays on this server. Once he had gotten his hands on a steaming mug of coffee, he slowly started to make his way to the 1A classroom. The internships had ended on Friday, meaning regular classes were picking back up today. Wilbur couldn't say he was thrilled to sit in the back all day while listening to teachers preaching things he didn't even understand. What the hell was a square root anyways? As he slid open the door to the classroom, a silence fell over the usually quite chatty teenagers, all eyes on Wilbur as he closed the door behind him. He quirked up one of his brows in confusion. Why are you all looking at me like that? Do I have something on my face? He questioned, a nervous chuckle falling from his lips. Had he done something without realizing? What, you went viral, man? Everybody saw the video. Kaminari was the first to speak up, practically yelling as he rose from his seat. Wilbur felt even more confused at that. What video? I have no idea what you're talking about, he murmured, eyes searching for any clues as to what was going on. This felt like a shitty prank, though it wasn't a particularly funny one. Somebody recorded the fight between Stain and you," Midoriya piped up, making Wilbur blink a few times. So, why does that matter? He hated feeling this lost, just wanting somebody to explain to him why this was such a big deal all of a sudden. What Kaminari and Midoriya are trying to say is that a bystander recorded the altercation between the hero killer Stain and you, and that it has been viewed by a lot of people online. Yaorazu was a true lifesaver. That didn't sound good, but it at least made a bit more sense. Okay, call me a boomer, but I really don't get why that's such a big deal. I already spoke to the police. I didn't break any laws. Not any they can prove, anyways. Wilbur murmured the last part into his cup before taking a sip. It is a big deal. You faced off against one of the worst villains currently out there, and you called him a baby man. The internet loves you, Mr. Soot, Mina exclaimed, an expression of awe on her features. That guy was one of the worst villains here. Wilbur was a bit surprised by that. Hell, even Hand Boy had been more put together than the guy Wilbur had faced. What kind of shit name is Stain anyways? The hero killer. That is so unnecessarily edgy, he muttered to himself as he approached his desk. The students were still staring at him, some in awe, others with something similar to distrust. I get that you probably saw the video and were a bit surprised, but I did tell you that I'm qualified to be here. I don't get why you all look so surprised about me taking on some villain when that's quite literally what you kids are training to do too. Wilbur sighed. That caused a few students to think for a moment, their stares finally leaving Wilbur. With all due respect, sir, we hadn't ever seen you in action before. We're all just a bit surprised by how you verbally took down a villain who is known to murder heroes and villains alike. Suyu was straight to the point as per usual, and Wilbur dearly appreciated it. Well, you saw what I did, heard what I said. Make of that what you will. You should be focusing on your schoolwork, not on whatever I do in my free time. With that, the topic was dropped for at least a while. Right as Wilbur was about to head off to the teacher's lounge for lunch, Bakugo approached his desk. As the other students left the room, only Wilbur and Bakugo were left behind. With a sigh, Wilbur looked down at Bakugo. Can I help you with something? He asked, hoping the answer was no. Of course, luck was not on Wilbur's side. Why do you know so much about being a villain? Bakugo demanded, fiery red eyes meeting Wilbur's bored brown ones. I made some mistakes when I was younger. One teeny tiny mistake snowballed into me getting wrapped up in something I shouldn't have. I thought I was doing the right thing, that I was making a difference for the better, but I see now that I was wrong. I paid the price for my mistakes, and I'm not the same man that I was back then anymore. Wilbur answered honestly, too tired to bother coming up with some witty remark to get the boy to back off. Looking down into his empty cup, he let out a wry chuckle. It only took me 3 wrong moves to end up a villain. Yet it took a hell of a lot more to become a good person. I know I'm no hero. I barely qualify as a decent person, but I don't think I'm a villain anymore, if that's what you're worried about. Bakugo scowled to himself, briefly looking away. The way his brows dipped together made Wilbur assume the boy was considered the older man's words. He turned back to look at the teacher, mouth opening for a moment before shutting again. Wilbur wondered what had changed, for this wasn't the same boy who had threatened to kill him a few weeks ago. When you threatened me with your bow, you actually considered shooting me, didn't you? He asked, tone wavering as if he didn't truly want to know the answer. Wilbur hummed for a moment, nodding without any hesitation. Not to kill you though. I grew up in a somewhat rougher environment. You caught me at a bad moment and I slipped. I'm sorry about that, by the way. Threatening a literal child with a bow for getting on my nerves is not one of my proudest moments, I'll admit. Wilbur chuckled softly as he shook his head a bit. I don't get you. You're clearly an idiot. You don't even know what viral means, and I've seen you struggle to follow Mr. Ectoplasm's math classes. Yet you're also a teacher and a half-decent hero. You piss me off, Bakugo grumbled. And for a moment all Wilbur could see was a young Tommy cutting a piece of Nikki's hair off just because he didn't like the fact she was hanging out with Wilbur more than him. Bakugo was clearly emotionally stunted. It didn't take a genius to figure that out, but Wilbur realized now that there was more to it than him just being a prick for the sake of being a prick. Yeah, I tend to have that effect on people. Wilbur laughed, shrugging a bit. You'll get used to it after a while, just give it some time. In the meantime, you should really work on your temper, mate. That caused the boy to devolve into a fit of yelling, mostly about how his temper was fine. Wilbur was the one who needed to check his temper, and he was a bastard. Wilbur couldn't stop himself from laughing. The image of Tommy and him having similar debates back in Pictopia still fresh in his mind. 10 to 10 to 10. Sitting up on top of a skyscraper, Carl replayed the video once more. He had lost count of the amount of times he had watched it by now, yet he still hadn't gotten much further in figuring out what exactly was going on. The group of pro heroes had been pretty easy to identify, though the kids hiding among them were a bit harder to find information about. One turned out to be the son of one of the pros on the scene, Todoroki Shoto. Another was the younger brother of one of Stain's previous victims, Ida Tenya. The last kid, the one the Namu had scooped up, Carl couldn't find anything about, only his name, Midoriya Izuku. All three of them were heroes in training at UA, and were part of 1A. Doing some digging into UA gave Carl a lot to work with. Apparently, an excursion had been attacked by a group of villains only a few weeks ago. The details of it were pretty vague in the media, though the UA servers had a lot more information about the attack stored away. Was it legal for Carl to access those servers? No, but Carl really needed to know. It wasn't like they were going to ever find out it was him anyways. His communicator was pretty much untraceable by the technology of this world. Turns out, the attack hadn't been stopped by All Might like the media said it was. No, instead a certain unnamed individual had managed to stall the villains until backup arrived. A day after the event, a new member was added to the faculty list. Wilbur Soot, hero named Fathian, was on paper a teacher's assistant with some added privileges that didn't seem to line up with his job title. For example, he was allowed to run hero training exercises even though he didn't even have a license. Carl frowned. How the hell had Wilbur managed to talk himself into one of the best hero schools around without a license? This whole situation was confusing. A yelp left his throat as a hand landed on his shoulders, head snapping towards the owner of the hand. He came face to face with a porcelain white mask, the smiley on it oozing a threatening aura. Dream, how'd you know where I was? Carl let out a nervous chuckle, hurrying to switch off his communicator. Oh come on now, Carl. You didn't seriously think I didn't know about your little dimension traveling hobby? I'm almost hurt. Dream drew out, smirk audible in his voice as he cocked his head to the side. Carl gulped. Aye, he started, but Dream cut him off. Don't worry, I'm not here to stop you. I'm actually here for somebody else. See, a little birdie told me somebody from my server ended up on this server, and we can't have that of course. Dream took a step back, approaching the edge of the rooftop. His netherite axe glistened in the sunlight, making Carl worry for Wilbur's fate if the admin did end up finding him. Who are you looking for? Maybe I can help, Carl offered, voice shaking a bit. He couldn't help it. Dream was a scary man. Sure, technically they had fought on the same side once, but really that was only because Sapnap had asked Carl to join. Carl had barely even spoken to Dream before. I'm looking for Wilbur. He went here after he died instead of perma-dying. It's unnatural, so I'm here to make sure this time he stays dead. Dream explained it like he hadn't just admitted to planning to murder a man. Isn't that a bit harsh? If he ended up here upon dying, maybe he's, meant to be here, Carl hesitantly suggested, flinching as Dream snapped to face him. I didn't ask for your opinion, Carl. If you know his location, give it to me. If you don't, find him. Dream's tone wasn't as light anymore, sounding a lot more serious. Carl shakily nodded, softly clearing his throat. I haven't seen any sign from him. I'll start looking though. He lied. He couldn't rat out Wilbur's location to a man dead set on killing him. As Dream disappeared into a wave of pixels, Carl let out a relieved sigh. Oh honk, things were not looking good for him. He had just lied to the admin of his home server to save the life of an ex-president turned terrorist turned hero. He had just wanted to check out a new universe, to gather some more stories for his library. How did he always manage to find himself in the middle of trouble everywhere he went? Wilbur's Wednesday started off with an unexpected meeting with Nezu. The bear had been waiting for Wilbur in the lounge, a bright smile on his features as Wilbur entered the room. Wilbur, do you have a moment? We need to have a talk. Nezu's phrasing made a shiver run down Wilbur's spine, the feeling bringing back memories of Phil calling a teenage Wilbur downstairs to have a chat after Wilbur's latest adventures. Young him had been a handful. Wilbur had a lot of respect for Phil for putting up with him. Any man that had to deal with teenagers sneaking out of the house deserved a medal in Wilbur's humble opinion. Am I in trouble? Wilbur joked, following after the bear towards his office. Nezu hummed for a moment. Not in trouble necessarily, but we do have to discuss some serious topics, he answered, making Wilbur's stomach twist. That didn't sound ominous at all. Is this about that whole stain ordeal? I talked with the cops and they said I was all good. Wilbur still didn't fully get why everybody was so worked up about the video. He didn't receive a response. Instead, Nezu just motioned towards the couch. UA has been under a lot of scrutiny by the public after the USJ attack. There has been a rise in villain attacks lately, plus with villains like Stain and Shigaraki gaining a following. There is a lot of tension at the moment. People are looking for somebody to fix everything, somebody who can solve the issues at hand. Your actions against Stain seem to have made some people think you are the answer. The problem is that in their eyes you were just a bystander who stepped in and said the right thing. Nezu started, tone calm and non-accusatory. He wasn't blaming Wilbur for stepping in, just stating the facts at hand. Once the footage of your actions went viral, there was a record amount of vigilante sightings. You inspired people to stand up against what they think is wrong, which in theory is wonderful, but also very illegal. That is why I want to put out a statement regarding your hero status. Once people realize you are indeed a licensed pro hero, I suspect the vigilante rates will go down again. Nezu explained, excitement present in his voice. That sounds great and all, but I'm not a licensed pro though. I did technically act as a vigilante, Wilbur pointed out, brows furrowing a bit. That seemed to be the right thing to ask as Nezu pulled a card from somewhere on his desk and extended it to Wilbur. Curiously craning his neck a bit, he took the card. It was made of hard, shiny plastic and had a photo of Wilbur on it, along with his hero name and his general information. The photo was taken when the man had been asleep on the couch in the teacher's lounge, beanie covering half his face. It was the only picture anybody had of you. We can get a better one at a later date. For now, it should do the job. Congratulations, Fathian. You are now officially a pro hero. Nezu grinned. Wilbur blinked a few times, admiring the card in his hand. He knew it shouldn't have been so surprising that Nezu had actually managed to get him a license. But it meant more to him than he could express to the bear sitting across from him, because this meant Nezu genuinely saw him as a good enough person to be a hero, even while knowing Wilbur's past. He knew the terrible things Wilbur had done, yet he still thought Wilbur had what it took to be a hero. A sniffle escaped him as he wiped his face with his sleeve, refusing to admit he had grown teary-eyed at the sight of the license. Thank you, Nezu. I appreciate it. I won't let you down, Wilbur promised, wholeheartedly meaning his words for once. Nezu chuckled, a soft smile on his lips. I trust you will not. I would not give you this license if I had any doubts about you, Wilbur. Now, another thing I wanted to discuss was getting you a hero costume. Wilbur chuckled, shaking his head a bit. I'm not wearing any bright neons. Like, I'll be upfront about that. I'll say pass to bright blue stripes. He joked, his earlier stress melting away as he chatted with Nezu. Fashion had never been Wilbur's specialty. He was a man who preferred comfort and practicality over aesthetics. Sweaters, coats and pants with lots of pockets and t-shirts made up most of his closet. So when handed an empty seat with a mannequin on it that he could draw his costume on, Wilbur hesitated. His pencil hovered above the paper for a minute before he finally got to work. He wasn't a great artist, so he made sure to write down little descriptions of everything he drew next to the drawing. It took him a while to get everything just right, but he was pretty proud of the final product. Nezu watched him work, occasionally commenting on whatever item Wilbur was working on. Wilbur appreciated the suggestions, since Nezu clearly knew more about costumes than Wilbur did. Once Wilbur was satisfied with his drawing, he handed it to Nezu, who told him he'd pass it on to the support course students as soon as possible. They continued to chat a little while longer, during which they ended up discussing the upcoming finals a bit. Nezu had a plan for the finals, and Wilbur was more than happy to be a part of it. 10 to 10 to 10. None of the students were told what the finals would consist of, which made sense considering out in the field they wouldn't know what they would encounter beforehand. At the same time, he could understand that it must have been nerve-wracking for the students to have to prepare for an exam they knew nothing about. Being a hero student sounded like hard work. Wilbur was starting to be pretty glad he had never gone to school before. Bless Phil's a Minecraft for homeschooling him. Most of the UA staff were gathered in the fake city UA had built for training purposes, chatting amongst themselves while waiting for the students to arrive. A few days prior, they had a meeting going over exactly how the finals would be taking place. Every teacher would be facing off against a duo of students, though the teachers would be getting a handicap to make it a bit more fair towards the students. The students had to either escape through a certain gate before the time ran out, or cuff the teacher with special handcuffs. The pairs were decided beforehand, and weren't left up to chance. All Might and Eraserhead had insisted on pairing up Bakugo Midoriya, which Wilbur wasn't about to let happen. Why, I get that you want them to settle their bad blood or whatever, but this seems a bit of a blunt approach to a sensitive issue, he pointed out, straightening up in his seat a bit. On the field, you sometimes have to work with people you don't like too. That's just life, Aizawa murmured, making Wilbur scoff. Come on, you can't actually be that dim. Bakugo clearly caused lasting damage to Midoriya's mental state. That's not the same as having to work together with someone you mildly dislike. Wilbur's voice rose a bit too loud for his own liking. If you really think this will be beneficial for the both of them, sure, go ahead. But when those two end up only fighting each other, don't act like they're being the fools here. Wilbur decided to dial it back a bit, mentally apologizing to Midoriya for failing to stop them. Nezu thought for a moment, looking between the three teachers currently glaring at each other. All right, that's settled then. Bakugo and Midoriya will be facing off against All Might in the finals. Wilbur wanted to scream, but instead just slouched in his seat. This was destined to be a shit show. In the end, Nezu decided Wilbur would be the one observing the finals to make sure everything ran as smoothly as possible. Wilbur was grateful he wouldn't have to fight, though he knew he would have to face the music at some point. He couldn't outrun his demons forever, even though he wouldn't actually be present on the training grounds during the exams. he was still standing with the other teachers in front of the entrance. Well, not all of them were standing. Nezu had claimed he wanted a higher vantage point before politely asking Wilbur if he would mind if the bear sat on his shoulders for a moment. That had been 30 minutes ago, and Nezu didn't seem to intend on moving anytime soon. Wilbur didn't mind. He used to carry Fundy like this all the time, and Nezu was a pretty light bear. Wilbur was dressed in his new hero costume. Nezu had forced it into his hands earlier that morning when he arrived, practically ordering him to go change. It was very reminiscent of his old Pugtopia uniform, but with a fresh twist. His trousers had been replaced by a pair of black combat pants with pockets running down most of the sides of them. As much as Wilbur loved his old coat, he knew he couldn't keep running around in it without damaging it. So his new costume had a brand new coat that was pretty similar to his old one, except the back was different. The old Ilmanberg flag had been hand-painted onto the back of the light brown fabric. He wore a plain white button-up underneath it, with a belt looped across his chest filled with materials he could use for crafting. They had even loaded one of the pockets with real diamonds, which Wilbur had almost immediately used to make a new axe. He couldn't enchant it for the time being, but it did the trick. His worn-out sneakers were replaced by a fresh set of combat boots. Signature beanie keeping his hair in place, fingerless gloves shoving off his blue-stained fingers. And to finish off the costume, Nezu had added a pair of goggles with all kinds of fancy tech in them that Wilbur didn't fully understand. He wasn't going to lie. He felt pretty badass in his new gear, though he still didn't get why most heroes chose for the brightest colors imaginable for their hero costume. With how much freedom heroes were given while designing, why would one ever pick bright blue over a more neutral tone that could actually help one blend in with one's surroundings? It made no sense, and Wilbur had a lot of opinions about it. As the students started to slowly arrive, Wilbur had expected Nezu to move, but the bear was more than content to just stay on the taller man's shoulders. Wilbur didn't question it, instead resting his hands on his hips, fingers barely brushing against the hilt of the axe hanging at his side. He received a few compliments on his new costume, which he deflected for the most part by saying Nezu did most of the actual designing. Once all the students were present, Aizawa and Nezu started to explain what the day would look like for the students. Wilbur could see a few of them grow nervous during the explanation, which made him pity the poor kids a bit. It must be pretty intimidating to have to face off against your own teachers. Wilbur remembered the first time he sparred against Technoblade. And man, sometimes he swore he could still feel the pain of the first blow the piglin had landed. He broke his wrist during that sparring session, and to this day it still sometimes made a weird clicking sound when he moved it. As Nezu started to list off the duos and who they would be facing off against, Wilbur shot Midoriya an apologetic look as his duo was announced. He promised to himself he would keep an extra close eye on their match. When everything was explained, the students and teachers split off to the areas where they would have their respective matches. Wilbur left for the control room with a woman who introduced herself as Recovery Girl. She seemed like a sweet old lady, and the two chatted for a bit before the matches started. I heard from All Might that there was a new staff member, but I hadn't gotten around to introducing myself yet. Pardon my manners. I tend to have my hands full most of the time with injured students and whatnot, Recovery Girl said as she sat down near one of the screens that would be displaying the matches in a moment. No worries, ma'am. It's totally understandable. You have quite an important job here, so no hard feelings. Honestly, it's probably more on me that we haven't met before. I've been meaning to swing by your office for a while now, but things keep coming up. Wilbur sheepishly chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck a bit. Oh, please tell me you aren't hiding any injuries from me just because you think you don't have the time to get it checked out. I can't handle another self-destructive staff member. Recovery Girl sighed as she looked at him, at which Wilbur rapidly shook his head. Oh no, it's nothing like that, don't worry. It's just, I've been experiencing some random changes to my body that I think stem from my quirk, but I'm not sure. They're not like a big deal or bothersome. I just thought it might be worth getting checked out someday. Wilbur shrugged a bit. The woman beside him hummed for a moment. I'll take a look at it after the finals for you, she decided, nodding to herself. Wilbur was about to object when the screens flickered to live. Straightening up in his seat, he got his notebook ready. He was supposed to do the countdowns and announcements as well as monitor the exams. So as he watched the first two students and the first teacher get into positions, he flicked on the microphone and started to count backwards. As he reached 1, the finals officially started. The first pair up were Kirishima and Sado against Cementos, which ended in both boys failing. They both had a time limit on their quirk, whereas Cementos could keep going for as long as he wanted. Wilbur noted down that they both needed to work on extending their quirk stamina before starting off the second match. Takoyami and Asui had a bit more luck in their match, the pair managing to cuff Ectoplasm with a wonderfully executed quirk combination attack. Writing down his compliments for both of them, he started off the third match. Ida and Ajaru also passed, though they didn't manage to handcuff Power Loader. Instead, Ajaru managed to escape. It had been a risky move, but it clearly paid off. The fourth match was an interesting one. Todoroki and Yaoyorozu were both bright students with strong quirks. But Eraserhead wasn't 1A's homeroom teacher for no reason. The man was smart, and his quirk gave him the upper hand most of the time since a lot of people on this server relied on their quirks too much, which was also the case for Todoroki and Yaoyorozu. During the match there were multiple instances where Aizawa clearly had the students beat, but wasted time lecturing them instead of actually stopping them. The communication between Todoroki and Yaoyorozu wasn't spectacular, leading to a few missteps along the way, but in the end they pulled it off. Their final attack on Aizawa resulted in him getting cuffed. Though by the looks of it, the teacher was letting them win because he was impressed by their plan. Wilbur had seen that man fight off a crowd of villains. There was no way 2 kids were enough to take him out no matter how heavy the weight on the man's arms were. Wilbur didn't buy it. Uraraka surprised Wilbur during her match. She was up against 13 with Aoyama, and during the final few moments of the match, she managed to floor the pro hero with a fighting technique Wilbur hadn't seen her use before. She must have picked it up during her internship. With minimal help from Aoyama, Uraraka snapped the handcuffs around 13's wrist, and the pair passed their finals. The pair after them were less lucky. Kaminari and Mina were up against Nezu, and to say they lost was putting it lightly. The bear managed to wipe out half of the fake training city within the first minute of the match, basically making escaping impossible for the 2 students. Except, when Wilbur got a better look at the area, he realized there was actually an escape path still free. Neither of the students noticed, and they both failed the final as a result. Kuda and Jiro also both passed, utilizing Present Mike's hatred for bugs against him. Though, Jiro did get injured during the match. Recovery Girl left the observation room to go help her, and she didn't return for a while. Wilbur started the next match anyways, which was Snipe against Shoji and Hagakure. The pair worked together rather well, and as Shoji feigned surrender, Hagakure used her teammates' diversion to restrain their teacher. Wilbur was pleasantly surprised, and noted down as much. Minta and Zero against Midnight was an odd match to watch. Zero got hit by the pro's quirk pretty early on, and automatically failed the final as he didn't actively take part in it anymore from that point. Minta, now left without a teammate, somehow managed to use his quirk to slow Midnight down enough to carry Zero to the exit. As much as Wilbur hated to admit it, the kid had fairly passed the final. Wilbur was just being petty, despising the boy's perverted nature with his entire being. The final match was the only one that genuinely worried Wilbur. Bakugo and Midoriya were both skilled students, but when put together all logic seemed to go out of the window. As Wilbur had predicted, it barely took the pair 1 minute to break into an argument, the explosive teen yelling at the shorter teen for the most petty shit Wilbur had ever heard. Stealing moves. Come on. He really had thought Bakugo had gained some sense over the last 2 weeks, but clearly he had been wrong. Things went from bad to worse real quick as All Might entered the picture. The pair managed to coordinate one attack together, which didn't end up doing much. After that, they were both taking hit after hit, at one point even getting slammed into each other by All Might. Wilbur winced at every hit, fingers hovering above the on button of the microphone. He couldn't watch this. In a last-ditch attempt to get Midoriya to the escape, Bakugo launches the boy using his explosion. All Might was quick to react, smacking the boy out of the air like he was nothing more than a fly. Even from the crappy angle Wilbur had of the fight, he could tell Midoriya's back was messed up from his landing. This was going too far. He was about to call off the match when a hand snatched his own hand away from the button. Flinching, Wilbur looked up to meet Aizawa's eyes. A heavy frown was on the man's features. He knows what he's doing. Don't interfere, the man grumbled, making Wilbur scoff. Knows what he's doing, my ass. He's going to fucking kill these kids, Eraserhead. Look at them. Midoriya can barely move and Bakugo is overusing his quirk. This will do lasting damage. He motioned towards the screen, right as All Might slammed the explosive teen against the ground once more. This is supposed to be an exam, not a life or death situation. I've seen battlefields less fucking brutal. Bakugo didn't get up after that slam, presumably finally having gotten knocked out. As Wilbur tried to pry his hands out of Aizawa's grasp, Midoriya somehow got back up to his feet. The teen dashed towards All Might and delivered one final punch that sent the hero flying. Not wasting any time, Midoriya scooped the unconscious teen up and carried Bakugo to the escape. Aizawa announced that they had won instead of Wilbur, the man still too upset to even look at the screen. In the end, both students were rushed to Recovery Girl's office, having extensive injuries that would definitely leave behind some lasting effects like Wilbur had feared. The other students were excused as the teachers gathered in one of the many meeting rooms of UA to discuss how the finals had gone. Wilbur had sort of zoned out from the moment Aizawa refused to let him stop the match to the second he sat down in one of the uncomfortable soft desk chairs scattered around the large table. He noted that All Might was missing from the meeting, though he couldn't say he was upset about that. Seeing the pro hero right now would probably not end well for either of them. Wilbur's self-control lessened with every passing second. I think that went rather well, if I do say so myself, Nezu cheerily announced, and Wilbur felt his stomach churn. Thickly swallowing, he tried to pull himself together. The wave of agreement that came from his fellow teachers made him feel sick. Had they not just seen the same match he had? His nails dug into the palms of his hands as he tried to keep quiet. Nezu started to go over all the matches one by one, briefly discussing each one before moving on. When he reached the final one, and had the guts to say it was probably one of the best matches, Wilbur snapped. Sorry, did we watch the same match? Because the match I watched was certainly not fucking wonderful. Though, I watched a grown man smack around two kids he knew weren't good at working together, and instead of going easy on them, like he was instructed to do, he egged them on. And now we have two injured kids. I told you pairing them up was a bad idea, and you said, oh, they'll be fine. They'll have to work together, so there's no way they'll get too hurt. And I believed you. Now look at what you've done. How can you say you're proud of this? Wilbur rose from his seat, slamming his hands against the desk. He was more than just upset. He was furious. He was devastated. And more than anything, he was worried for Midoriya and Bakugo. You traumatized two students. Wilbur was too emotional to care about the looks of concern and pity he was receiving. Eyes fixated on the beat sitting at the head of the table. I thought you guys were supposed to be the heroes. Well, newsflash, heroes don't do shit like this. And I would know. This is the shit I would have done against Tommy back then, and you knew that already, Nezu. You knew and still went through with it. Wilbur's voice was growing hoarse the more he yelled, cracking as he mentioned Tommy's name. Pushing his chair back, Wilbur made his way to the exit. I need some air. As he stumbled through the empty halls of UA, he couldn't get the image of the pit out of his head. Something about that last fight had just hit a little bit too close to home. Memories of watching Tommy and Techno face off in the pit as Wilbur cackled from the sidelines. He had been too far gone at that point, unable to think clearly no matter how hard he tried. Hand brushing over his healed wound, Wilbur tried to stay present. He couldn't get lost in his own head. Not right now. Instead of going outside, his feet took him to Recovery Girl's office. He wanted to check up on the kids before going home, just to give him a peace of mind. Gently knocking on the door, he slid it open only after he had gotten permission to do so. He shot the woman a tired smile as he closed the door behind him. How are they? He kept his voice low, not wanting to wake up the two sleeping students. They were pretty roughed up, but I managed to heal up most of their injuries. It will take another few sessions for them to be all better, but with how exhausted they were before I even got to use my quirk, I couldn't do much without fully destroying their stamina. Recovery Girl explained, a sigh escaping her lips as he looked at the boys. Wilbur nodded a bit, even if he honestly didn't understand much of that explanation. I'm just glad they'll be okay, he murmured, the woman humming in agreement. If you want, I can take a look at you right now. I have some time left before I am leaving, Recovery Girl offered. Wilbur looked down at his hands for a moment, considering if he was mentally in the right state to deal with that right now. Sure, if you wouldn't mind. And with that, Wilbur told Recovery Girl how he had ended up here. He left out a lot more details than he had with Nezu, only telling her the basics of his old life. They didn't matter to his physical health at the moment anyways. He explained how his skin had turned blue in certain areas a while after he arrived, and how he was going gray. Recovery Girl ran a few tests, but it would take a while for the results to come in. Until then, she asked him to keep track of any other changes. Wilbur promised to do so, and left soon after. He spent that night on his roof. If anybody heard his sobs and screams that night, nobody dared to mention them. Friend was the only reason he managed to calm down hours afterwards, the cat clawing at his hand until he petted her. His throat felt dry, but he couldn't be bothered to get a glass of water. Instead, he pulled Friend closer to his chest and let sleep take hold of his mind. Maybe some dreamless sleep would make him forget about everything that had happened today.